Good morning, everybody. If you can take your seats, we're going to get started. Doug, that means you. My name is Mike Frank. I'm the director here of Hoover's Washington, D.C. office. I want to welcome everyone. I'm going to quickly turn it over to Jeremy Carl, a research fellow who has made the trip from the left coast to join us today. And Jeremy's been doing some terrific work on environmental and energy policy in recent years, and is the inspiration, along with Steve Hayward, for this event. And I want to especially welcome Sir Roger Scruton for being here. I think this is your first event here at this office. Welcome. Hope there'll be many more. And with no further ado, Jeremy, the podium is yours.
Thanks everybody for coming out. I think I want to, given that left may be a little bit out of vogue right now in DC, I want to be on the opposite coast, not the left coast, as my branding. But in any case, thanks everybody for making it out here, and thank you in particular to Sir Roger Scruton for taking the time to be with us today. The genesis of this meeting is actually some conversations that Steve Hayward and I have had just over the past couple of years, that it would be sort of a great opportunity to sort of go to DC and gather a bunch of folks, many, although certainly not necessarily all, conservatives who were sort of interested in energy and environmental policy, and really kind of have an out-of-the-box discussion about those sorts of issues outside of the framework of we love this bill, we hate this bill, or whatever is on the Hill at the moment. And so in many ways, the timing of this is really good, in that we're sort of in this interregnum where everything is in theory possible. And to kind of just talk both in a more philosophical way, as Roger is going to do, but also as we move into the panel a little bit in a practical way about, what should a conservative environmental policy or thoughts of stewardship really look like. And I think that's it's very much a slate in which you can write a lot of interesting stories, and so I think one of the things we want to do here in conversation with many of you is to really sort of tell that story and open up that for discussion. And so to begin that, I'm going to go turn that over to my partner in crime here, Steve Hayward, who, if you know Steve, is a great irony, is now at UC Berkeley. Steve is I'm not going to give you his whole bio, but a very distinguished person who I've joked, and this joke's probably getting a little bit old now that I'm 43, but I always joke that I want to be Steve when I grow up, in that we both have kind of have this sort of unusual dual careers in both writing a lot about pure politics and elections, and you may have read some of my things in National Review Online and elsewhere, and we've also written some fairly serious things on energy and environmental policy. But Steve has done this enormously effectively over a number of years. Has a doctorate from the Claremont Graduate School, and was at AEI out here for a number of years, and has written a fantastic 2-volume biography, The Age of Reagan, which I highly recommend for folks who are interested in a great look at that president. But anyway, he's a wonderful guy, and my partner in crime in really putting this together, so I'm going to open it up and give it over to Steve. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Hoover. Although I have to say, Jeremy, you say you want to be me when you grow up. What makes you think I'm grown up, for starters? And second, third, right? As Jeremy mentions, we're in the midst of what looks to be regime change at the moment, which I certainly hadn't expected would take this shape. But nonetheless, it may make it even more propitious to try and step back and take in a wider scene and take up a heterodox proposition, which goes like this. Maybe it's conservatives are the people who are now best suited to pick up the tattered banner of environmental protection. Conservatives are superb at what you might describe as the conservation of social ecosystems. It's a large part of what conservatism is about. Why not extend the same kind of creativity and logic to physical ecosystems? Now, I think it may be fruitless to try and identify the first environmental thinker in modern senses of that word, but you might be able to make out a case for Edmund Burke, the father of modern post-Enlightenment conservatism, you might say. He wrote a lot of interesting things about the relation of man and nature, especially in The Vindication of Natural Society, one of his more obscure books. I'll sort of skip over it. He'll talk about what ruin human beings can make of the environment and of wildlife in their rapacity and insatiability for material things. Now, hitherto, people on the right have tended to offer just one partial alternative to what might be described as conventional environmental views, and that's what's known as the free market environmental school. But the purely economic approach, as necessary and useful in many instances, is also limited in many important instances, such as urban air pollution, global commons problems, climate, ozone depletion, oceans, and so forth. And those defy solution through any simple division of property rights, to borrow a strangely overlooked observation by none other than Hayek himself. So our keynote speaker this morning is Sir Roger Scruton. Sir Roger, and I love saying that, it's just such a long overdue honor. It's really fun. Sir Roger, I think, has written more books than I've read on subjects as various as food and wine. His wine book, I have to mention, is called I Drink, Therefore I Am, A Philosopher's Guide to Wine. He's written books on art, beauty, sports, architecture, music, sex. It's not a manual, it's just philosophy. Theology. He's even written a novel and a charming memoir I highly recommend called Gentle Regrets. And even lately, what I call his first self-help book called How to Be a Conservative. I'm tempted to say that if I haven't figured out how to be a conservative now, I'm not sure a self-help book will help me, but I often have kidded Roger that if he were an American instead of British, he would have written The 7 Habits of a Highly Effective Conservative. Or that other old Woody Allen joke comes to mind. If Kant had been an American, he would have written The Categorical Imperative and 6 Ways to Make It Work for You. I did tell Roger once, he didn't know this, that I found a Roger Scruton iPhone case on Amazon. So, penetrating popular culture too. So Roger aims precisely at the broader treatment of the environment in his book a few years back called How to Think Seriously About the Planet, The Case for Environmental Conservatism. I think the book deserves to take its place among the most ambitious and serious attempts to consider the environment from the ground up. The book issues profound and difficult challenges to both conventional environmental thinking and to conservatives alike. And as such, I think it may succeed best in annoying everybody about something. And that counts as something new and useful, I think. Following Sir Roger's keynote address and a short break, we'll reconvene with a roundtable discussion. The panelists I will introduce in due course. And I will moderate that discussion and attempt to curate it in a little different way than the typical Washington panel with miscellaneous questions and answers. We're going to try and spend some time with themes and development and involve a lot of audience participation. So prepare your questions and comments as we go forward. And with that, please join me in welcoming Sir Roger Scruton.
As Steve has said, that my book, How to Think Seriously About the Planet, is an attempt to visit this agenda from a broadly conservative perspective and build up an argument which will show how the environmental problems can be incorporated into a wider vision of what politics is about and how we resolve essentially political problems. And when writing it, I began with the sense that here is something incredibly important, an agenda, a collection of problems and difficulties which have been seized, confiscated even by the left. That's especially true in Europe, of course, where we have these did have very active left-wing movements in Germany and elsewhere, for whom the environment was the leading political issue, which involved reconsidering almost the whole settlement of post-war politics. And this left-wing capture of the issue has persisted since then and is very heavily funded here in America. And it involves an emphasis on vast and global problems, and Steve mentioned some of them, the global commons and so on, and in particular on climate change. Climate change is, of course, if it's happening, which we seem to think that it is a very serious issue. But it's so serious and so vast an issue that nobody really knows what the solution to it might be. But on the left, it's a very attractive issue because it seems, being a global problem, it can only admit of a global solution. So there's the search for global solutions and, of course, the privileged people who will have the business of applying them, who will be the cell of left-wing activists who will be empowered to dictate to the rest of us. But, however, looking for a global solution to this problem and not finding it, and the problem remains in a global form as a way of delegitimizing all our small-scale local problems, delegitimizing in particular the nation-state and the ways in which nation-states have evolved to confront the difficulties that naturally arise in human communities. And I felt that this is part of a general culture of repudiation, which repudiation of the inheritance of law and order and national boundaries and so on, which are the unspoken premises of our particular political culture. And this manifests itself in a purely negative response to rival solutions, which goes even so far as censorship. And we've all seen the way in which, if you dissent from the standard from the orthodoxy about climate change, you are branded as a climate denier or something, on the model of a Holocaust denier, someone who has overstepped the boundary of what is morally possible. This is actually something which you're all familiar with, which is happening in America in particular, which is the growth of censorship about all the issues which briefly matter to a certain class of people. That discussion is immediately replaced by division, an absolute division between those who are saved and those who are damned. And you find this, of course, in all the issues that have dominated politics here in recent times, in particular the gay rights issue, for instance, about which there's only one permitted view. And if you want even to open the discussion, then, of course, you are branded immediately as a homophobe or a bigot. The word bigot is extremely interesting because it's used today only by bigots to condemn the people who disagree with them. Anyway, the result of this, of course, is that there is no philosophy really emerging from the left-wing position, although many of the people involved are, of course, well-meaning, intelligent people who really want to confront these issues. The philosophy gets silenced in the long run. Just a few little ideas are put forward, like the idea that we must obey the precautionary principle in all these matters of environmental debate, without any attempt really to examine what that precautionary principle is supposed to be. And one result of this is that the response on the right among conservatives becomes also one of belligerent denial. People saying there is no climate change, there is no global warming, the oceans are not depleted, and anyway, even if they were, this isn't a problem. We'll manufacture artificial fish in laboratories, etc. So, and the result, of course, is that on neither side is listening to the other. And my view is it would be better to reclaim the agenda, to admit that there is a problem, and many problems about the environment, but also that we conservatives have a creative response to it that issues from our distinctive vision. Steve mentioned then Edmund Burke, who has been a great influence on me, and my book, How to Think Seriously About the Planet, which in the English edition is called Green Philosophy, which I much prefer, is very much inspired by that leading thought of Edmund Burke's, that society is not a contract among the living, but a kind of relation of partnership between the living, the unborn, and the dead. A thought that he develops in his reflections on the French Revolution in a way which is absolutely devastating, I think, of the position adopted by Rousseau and his followers. And that position, if properly developed, is for me also the foundation of a conservative response to environmental questions. So conservatives are challenged by environmental questions to look for the aspect of their worldview that would equip them to deal with these problems. And the free market emphasis of the American think tanks, including this one, which is actually one of the most hesitant in adopting such an ideology, but that has led to a quite creative attempt to find market solutions to environmental problems. But for many, this is the point where the market needs to be qualified. We know that there is this thing called market failure, which is just another word for saying issues where the free market exacerbates the problem rather than curing it. But we also know that there are subtle ways of adapting market solutions so that they don't have that effect. But these problems give us the point of intersection of the global and the local. And a free economy is, I think we would admit, inherently globalizing, has a globalizing tendency at least. And this tends to push conservatives in the same globalizing direction as the left, ever more remote from the real concerns of people. As we've seen in these recent electoral results, both in Europe and here, the concerns of people today are rather different from those 50 years ago. They are particularly concerned about the sweeping away of their known and managed environments and ways of life by the winds from nowhere. And that, of course, is not helped. They're not helped by the thought that we have some friendly winds which are blowing in our direction from the multinational corporations, as opposed to the unfriendly ones from the global green activists. The fact is that globalization for ordinary people seems a bit like the true origin of the problem. Now, I don't think that is the only last thing to be said, but we have to bear it in mind. So my view, anyway, is that we need another approach. We need to recapture the agenda from the left and to rewrite it in terms of concepts that engage with conservative thinking. And in particular, to acknowledge the primary source of the anxiety that engenders environmental politics, which is anxiety about our home. The crucial temps here being our and home. There is a place where we are and which we love, to which we are attached, which is the origin of both of our political sentiments and of our search for a meaningful life. And there is this first-person plural, the we, of the people who are entitled to live there. And this is our way of dealing with the real big issues of identity and continuity and so on, is to try to identify both those things, the first-person plural to which we belong, and the place where that first-person plural is settled, installed, and committed to. So the idea of our home is really what I think it's all about. And both of those words, our and home, are anathema to a certain kind of leftist. The we of settlement is an exclusive we. It's not about opening the world to everyone. It's about maintaining the bit of the world that is ours by right and by inheritance. Home also is anathema, because in your home there are embarrassing things from the left-wing point of view, like parents and children. These are things which don't enter the calculation. But, of course, they do enter, if not the calculation, the heart of ordinary people. So we also must acknowledge that there are two contending forces in the conservative psyche. And the negotiated balance of these forces is, or ought to be, the real aim of conservative politics. First of all, there is the desire for freedom, and along with freedom, the free economy and the culture of enterprise, which has made this country in particular so great. But there's also the countervailing force, which is the desire for settlement, family, and home. And I think it's the tension between those two which has made it so difficult to have to evolve a coherent environmental policy, especially among conservatives. So I think it's by working on the second aspect of conservatism, the desire for settlement and home, that we can recuperate the environmental agenda. And some sense of why this is so can be gained from the response to the big issue, almost the only issue that the left recognise in this area, which is the issue of climate change. Now, this has been not just discussed, but addressed as though it were absolutely at the top of the agenda when our Conservative government, or when David Cameron's coalition government was elected. It took over from the Labour government, unaltered, the environmental agenda. What had happened under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown was that in order to answer to the anxieties of the left-wing activists who animate the Labour Party, the leadership of the party said, we will address this problem of climate change. That will be at the top of our agenda. And the first thing they did was to change the name of the ministry, or the Department of the Environment. It became the Department of the Environment, Rural Affairs and Climate Change. And so you could have a Department of Climate Change. But having achieved that, they left the matter there. And nothing else was done except to pay ritual obeisance to this great problem in every possible way. And in due course, the Conservative Party inherited this Department of the Environment and Climate Change, and also went along with the agenda, which was supposed to be adopted in due course, and they did adopt the agenda. Unlike the Labour Party, which didn't do anything, the Conservative Party did do something, started subsidising the construction of wind farms all over the Highlands of Scotland and elsewhere. Now, the wind farm, you've had this menace also imposed upon you in a big way, and I think it's worth examining just why this is not a solution, and why people nevertheless pursue this policy. It's not a solution because it's clearly not adaptable to changes in the climate. It's not adaptable to new solutions that will replace it. A wind farm once installed just remains there as an unsightly object which does irreversible damage, not to the atmosphere, of course, but irreversible damage to the emotions of the people who are living in its neighbourhood. And a wind farm is very big, and the things are very big, and they're all over Germany, of course, and they have an extremely negative impact on the people who live in the country in Germany, who have lost what they wanted to be in the country to possess, namely the beauty of their environment. Wind farms also have lots of unintended consequences, as you know. They're extremely damaging to migrating birds and bats and all and wildlife of that kind. But it's also unreal as a solution. In Germany, where the solution has been to invest all politics in this matter of so-called renewable energy resources, they can produce at the best 20% of the power that's needed, and that depends upon the wind, how it is. They have to shut down if the wind is too strong, and if the wind isn't blowing, then of course electricity has to be brought from elsewhere anyway. But in Germany, this became such an important matter politically that the government said, we're going to entirely depend upon this kind of resource, and we're not going to have nuclear power stations, which are an environmental catastrophe. Why they say that, nobody knows, but they do say that. And since the the wind farms only produce 20% of the needed electricity. The solution is to plug into the grid of the French electricity system and buy their electricity instead. French electricity is entirely produced by nuclear power stations. So the unreality of the solution is very apparent to anybody who thinks about this. But nevertheless, it wasn't the reality of the solution, it was the appearance of it that mattered. It looked like honourable and respectable behaviour, and it's a symbolic achievement. And of course, when you think of these solutions of this kind, you recognise that inevitably the state is taking over. In Britain, the wind farms were subsidised by the state. The state provided the capital to build these things, and you pay back a little bit over the years from the profits of the operation. But it means that essentially the state is committed into investing in things which actually are of no use in solving the problem for which are supposed to justify their use. And of course, all those are trivial defects compared with the real defect, which is that they are an offence to the only motive that counts, the motive in people to protect their environment. Why do people protect their environment? It's because it's theirs. And this is our place that we want to protect from damage and from degradation. But given that the wind farms are the damage and the degradation, in what sense are people's motives being satisfied by them? It's a postponing of the real solution. The real solution to the problem of clean energy is a scientific one. Obviously, we've got to find ways of producing the energy that we need by ways that don't pollute the atmosphere. And people have an idea of which way to go, like nuclear fusion, perhaps. But that solution requires vast investment in research probably of an international kind. But that's not actually the reason why the left-wing agitators in Britain have been so keen on the wind farms. For them, it's the damage that they do which is exciting. Because it breaks the grip of the middle classes on the environment. Those people who live under wind farms, enjoying their nostalgic feelings to old England, are now uprooted and cast free from their own nostalgia. So this is it's by being an offence against the NIMBYs, so-called, that the wind farm attracts so much endorsement. So anyway, that's an example of the many unreal solutions that are being imposed upon us by this global agenda. And I think that we should really turn away from that global agenda until we have the science that enables us to produce a realistic solution, and turn our attention to the problems that can be solved locally, and where the local solution will spread of its own accord. And here is one of them, and I think this is very important in America, which is the problem of plastic pollution. And most of the plastic that we encounter, especially if we live in the countryside and see it drifting around the roads and the waterways, most of it is the result of unnecessary regulations, which are themselves the result of multinational lobbying. In the case of the European Union, which is a very interesting institution because it is entirely created by lobbying, regulation after regulation has been passed concerning hygiene and food production, and the lobbyists, mostly supermarkets, have succeeded in their goal, which was to ensure that all food comes wrapped in plastic. Meat and in particular. You can sell loose vegetables on the market here and there, and you can have parts of the supermarket devoted to them, but for the most part food has to be wrapped up in this packaging, and 25% of the weight of goods going out of the supermarket in the shopping trolley is plastic, which is taken off and thrown away. You can recycle some of it, but the effort of recycling it is beyond most people's competence. And the result of this, of course, is that even if only 1% of this escapes into the environment, that 1% gets into the rivers, goes down into the ocean, and adds itself to the great Pacific platform, which people say is 4 times the size of Texas, of bits of plastic floating around, but not just polluting the surface of the sea, but also getting into the food chain because fish and birds eat it and often die painfully as a result. And this is a kind of area where a simple regulation could change everything. Just say, no, it's not allowed. You have to sell food as it is. You can put it in a paper bag, but don't wrap it up in plastic. All the health and safety lobby will object to this, but they're part of the problem. And the bureaucratic way of solving problems, as you know, is to disaggregate them. You know, that here's a problem that this might be infectious, so it has to be wrapped in plastic. The bureaucrat solves the problem just with that one solution, and it was not part of his brief to take account of all the other problems that result from him solving it in that way. Much more effective is to take this matter out of the hands of bureaucrats and say this is the way food is sold, and any attempt to interfere with this and to provide polluting materials around the food is forbidden. Now, if you do that in one country, given the global economy, the solution will spread. You know, people, if you forbid the wrapping of goods generally in plastic, then most of the plastic that comes into this country from China will stop coming in, and the Chinese themselves will have no motive to wrap their goods in plastic. The use of plastic will diminish rapidly all around the globe. So that's an example of a problem that can be addressed locally, where the result will be a global solution, but gradually growing. And I think there are many ways of that kind in which we can address a problem locally, and the solution can amplify itself through the working of the global market. But leaving that to one side, there is, of course, the tragedy of the commons from which all this begins. You're all familiar with the article by Garrett Hardin which introduced this idiom, the tragedy of the commons, meant to be a kind of paradox of collective practical reasoning, comparable to the prisoner's dilemma and so on. That reasonable beings who share a resource will all have a motive through self-interested rational calculation to deplete that resource in their own favour, so that the commons inevitably will cease to be a resource, so that rational beings sharing a resource will destroy it, and that will be the reasonable thing to do. And this is one of the paradoxes of social choice which have been investigated by game theorists and the rest. So how do we address this? It's an example of a multi-person game. We've got each has a goal, which is to get as much fish as he can from the lake which he shares, and there's others who are doing the same. What would be a solution to this problem? And we know that there are solutions, and that human beings have found them and acted upon them. A traditional knowledge bank about as to how the resource can be replenished, acquaintance between the players in the game, they know each other and they can reprove each other, and perhaps a system of punishments and a legal order with which to rectify and correct any bad behaviour. Now, and there are plenty of examples of that happening. And Elinor Ostrom, as you may very well know, won a Nobel Prize in economics for her work on showing how not only how solutions, game theoretical solutions to the problem can be easily derived theoretically, but also by showing that actual human communities had developed those solutions, not in the terms that the game theorist would use, but in terms of their own sense of what is permitted and what is not, what is honourable and what is not. And the fisheries around the north of Norway were maintained by this kind of solution, that each family had a right to take so much fish from the waters and an area which was theirs, and there was a kind of local legal system adjudicating any cheating, and it was a renewable resource for 100 years until the socialist government nationalised it. Fisheries, in fact, have been a very good illustration of the damage done by attempting a global solution. In all of our coastal waters in the north of Europe, let's say Britain, Denmark, Norway, Sweden and the Baltic and so on, they were all sustainable resources fished in a sustainable way until the European Union came along and said that the price of joining the European Union is that you must join our common fisheries policy, which was cobbled together the day before the signatures were to be put on the paper. And, of course, the government said, OK, not realising that this meant that the North Sea and the Channel and so on, all those, and the Irish Channel, which have been maintained as sustainable resources, were now open to pillaging by the Spanish trawlers. As a result, there isn't any fish left in the North Sea. And that's an example of a global solution which is supposed to be environmentally friendly, but because it's not policed by any sense of membership or who owes what to whom, but only by this multinational anonymous bureaucratic body, has essentially introduced the tragedy of the commons where it was not present before. So one needs, in pursuing these solutions, one needs to identify people, a community settled in a given place with a local law founded in agreements and in natural justice, and with the power to exclude intruders. That's the most important thing, this power to exclude, which is, again, an extremely offensive thing on the left. The left-wing view of the world is that exclusion is the problem, not the solution. So the local nature of the jurisdiction is here essential. As it were, a community creates an envelope within which it exists, a legal and social envelope, a boundary. And this is deeply offensive to the leftist agenda, which tells us to gather everything up under a single global governance. But it's precisely global governance that opens the way to the tragedy of the commons, as I've just tried to illustrate. So part of the problem, as I see it, is to find a motive that leads people to look after the environment for themselves. So the motive of rational self-interest is called upon by market solutions, and equally by the leftist global solutions founded on some kind of top-down coercion or treaties that will need enforcing. And the problem with the approach through treaties, which is of course a very important part of a rational solution, but the problem with it is that you can't enforce a treaty against a state that doesn't have a rule of law and therefore is not open to pressure from its own citizens to obey the treaty. This is the problem. This was always the problem with the old Soviet empire, but it still remains a problem with China. How can you guarantee that the signature of a treaty by the Chinese really is a commitment to doing what the treaty says? And we know that America, in particular, when a treaty is signed and ratified by Congress and so on, by Senate rather, that you will obey it on the whole. And if you don't, there'll be lobby groups here within the country who say, look, this is being violated and this is a shameful thing. Okay, so treaties are important, but simply to rely on treaties when the governments in question are incapable of obeying them is obviously not to have a solution at all. Now, in addition to rational self-interest, of course, we in the Anglophone world in particular have developed all kinds of common law solutions to our environmental problems. In my book, I go through this because I think it's something that's rarely understood. The leading case in tort, which created strict liability in tort, what you call enterprise liability, Rylands and Fletcher, from the 1860s, was the first real attempt to engage with the environmental problems of the new industrial economy. And it's a judgment made in a common law court by a judge. It forced Parliament then to do things in response to that. But what the common law does is return the problem to the people who are the victims of bad behaviour or who have a grievance. It's there to provide remedies. And that's an interesting feature of the common law. It's a remedy providing institution. And of course, if the problem is an environmental problem, the remedy is to be granted to those people who are suffering from environmental pollution. And I give other cases of the way in which equity in English law has been used to clean the rivers that were polluted largely by local governments, who were fined for their bad behaviour, but could easily afford the fine. But whereas equity gives the remedy of injunction to the individual victim, and to defy an injunction is to commit a crime, and no local government was able to do that. So there are some very interesting solutions which grow from our traditional way of dealing with the social problems in the courts. But my main emphasis in the book is on the motive that I call oikophilia, which I think is an unexplored motive. We rational beings do act in pursuit of our own self-interest. What matters to me? And this is very important, and market solutions, as I say, address that. But we don't only exist in the first-person singular. We exist in the first-person plural, too. As I said earlier, this concept of the we, of the shared predicament, is vital to practical reasoning. We reflect on what we want, what will happen to us, and what we owe to others. So we, this first-person plural, is a necessary input into practical reasoning, and it is for most of us, it's a we defined across generations. That's where Burke's observation in his treatise in his work on the French Revolution is so important. We are not just this generation living now. We are something that belongs to a continuous development from one generation to the next. We have obligations not just to people who are already dead, but also to people who don't yet exist. And that sense of an obligation which stretches across time is surely part of what we're searching for, if we're searching for a motive that enables environmental questions to be addressed by ordinary people rather than imposed, by governments which impose solutions. So I argue that this we is part of what defines our sense of home. We are homecoming creatures, and there's a lot of interesting philosophy by Germans about this, but of course it's philosophy that was eclipsed by the result of the primitive way it was interpreted by Hitler, and so it's sort of entered a shadowy period. But it is nevertheless the case that we do address these environmental problems in our immediate environment and cooperate to find solutions which involve us addressing them not as in terms of my interest, but in terms of our interest. And this first-person plural is only animating because we are settled in a place that is ours. When passing through a place that is not yours, you don't have the same motive to clean up the environment. And We have actually found this extremely obviously in Britain, where we have a very carefully maintained environment, the environment especially of England, which has been looked after for 200 years by the followers of John Ruskin and others, as a beautiful, sustainable resource in which natural beauty takes precedence over human use. But we've also been subject over the last 15 years or so to massive transitions of migrant populations, mostly from Eastern Europe, who have not got that tradition. And as a result, the rivers don't have any fish in them, and there are camping sites everywhere and so on, because people don't have the same feeling about the place where they're passing through as they have about the place which is theirs. So this love of home, an attachment to children and parents and so on, this is what produces the sense of responsibility towards the neighbourhood as such, and it's inseparable, I argue, from the sense of beauty. That's why beauty is so important in this matter. Our love of beauty isn't just a love of looking at things, it's part of our sense of belonging to them and they to us. Much of the environmental agenda on the left comes from neglecting this particular aspect of the human condition. It's one of the most important aspects, and everybody is motivated by it, but it's not the shallow thing that empiricists tend to think it is. The love of beauty is part of our metaphysical understanding of our condition as human beings, and it goes hand in hand with our sense that we are responsible for all those things to which we belong. So, and the sense of responsibility comes in part from the knowledge of my own contingency. You know, my existence is a contingent matter. It wasn't necessary. I'm, as Heidegger puts it, I'm geworfen, thrown into the world without an explanation. But for that very reason, my being here and in the place that I am and with the relations that are around me, that defines what I am towards the world. It defines in particular the burden of responsibility which comes through being a rational creature in the first place. And this burden of responsibility is not a contractual matter. It's not founded on deals and agreements that I've made with my neighbours. It's rather a matter of piety, of the transcendental obligations that all of us have towards the world in which we find ourselves. So that motive, then, is a very complicated one, and one of the purposes of my book was to express it, to amplify it, and to show just how it spreads through our day-to-day life and fills the sense of what we are individually with a wider conception of what we are communally. And that's the motive which I think conservatives have always actually in the end relied upon in order to differentiate them from those who regard the world simply as a resource to be exploited. But that's probably where I should stop.
Well, I'll open up the floor to questions momentarily, but I'll ask the first one because it always helps get questions going. Well, first of all, an observation, Roger. I have a new epithet for your critics to use on you. They'll call you a plastophobe. Have you not been called that yet?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Well, you have now. So, a particular question on the climate business. You mentioned, and I think I generally agree, that the broad solution would be simply new forms of low-polluting energy that are cheap and scalable. That's the mission of Sam Thernstrom and Lee Lane and a whole lot of people here in this room. Let me ask you about another remedy that is occasionally discussed, especially if climate change were to come in at the higher end of the long-range forecasts that are sometimes given. And that remedy is either goes by the name of geoengineering or solar radiation management, right? You know, fiddling with the reflectivity of the upper atmosphere and so forth. Obviously, that would have to be carried on at a global scale. Lots of coordination problems. Have you given any thought to that matter? And does some of your skepticism of globalism lead you to skepticism of that approach to the idea?
Well, this is an interesting question. I've discussed it with Lee Lane here when I was writing this book, and Lee has done lots of work on the matter. And if there's no other solution, that has to be contemplated. obviously. If the Earth really does need cooling down, and this is the only way we can think of doing it, we've got to try and secure some kind of international agreement that will enable us to do it without offending people. But every sort of managing the climate in this extreme meddling way will have unintended consequences which we don't understand. It might produce vast rainfalls in one part of the world and a complete aridity in another. The people in those parts of the world are going to be against it, and not only against it, might actually start sabotaging it, etc. So I think it would create so many political problems that it must be a last-ditch solution, if at all. And also it's a solution which has the same structure as the problem, namely that it's a global transition which takes the whole matter out of our local capacities. It's something which changes the world completely and leaves us with another. If it deprives us of our natural way of dealing with these things.
Yeah, trading one problem for another.
Yeah.
Or several, right, yeah. Let's hold it open to the audience. Now, we are webcasting this and videotaping it, so wait for the microphone. Let's see. I saw a question here in front in the middle. So wait for the microphone, please, and take it away. You might identify yourself, get your name and affiliation, if you would, please.
Ken Foster, I work. I was wondering, we're looking at this, and you're talking about minimizing our impact on the economy, and then Steve mentioned the possibility of manipulating the environment. What about nuclear energy? Putting a big, heavy emphasis on nuclear energy, which seems to be the most environmental friendly source. It's just sitting there.
Right. We may take this up some in the roundtable panel coming up. I don't know, Roger, if you have particular views.
Well, yeah, I agree with this, that it is, as things stand, it's the cleanest possibility. But there is, we can't deny there's all the problem of disposing of the waste, of nuclear waste, which I think it has some alarming aspects to it, because this is a potential weapon as well, this nuclear waste. So it's an interim solution, however. And what is interesting, as I said, is that in Germany, the agitation on the left has made it impossible for people to adopt this solution. But they have to plug into the French grid, nevertheless, which has adopted this solution. So it's extremely interesting. It's a source of great hypocrisy. The word nuclear was made into a kind of term of abuse at a certain point. And so people on the left in particular don't want to touch it. But you're right, it may be what we need.
Maybe that's why people on the left don't like the family, but we called it the nuclear family.
So there you are.
Isn't that
contribution to political thought, at least.
Isn't that a test of their insincerity? That is, the environmentalists.
Well, we'll come back to that. Mark Sagoff may or may not talk about this particular question, but right now there's I've been very close to all this, there's a lot of environmentalists who have rethought their position on nuclear power and now are pro-nuclear. And I'll tell this briefly. Again, this is conservatives. We meet in think tanks and have conferences and form journals. People on the left, they have to do protests, as we know, this week. So a few months ago, when California announced it was closing its last nuclear power plant in 10 years, a group of these left-leaning environmentalists staged a protest in front of the Sacramento office of the Natural Resources Defense Council, which just made my whole day. I thought never thought you'd ever see something like this. Signs, And anyway, we'll say more about that in the next panel. Martin Wooster, you had your hand up here, right here in front.
Hi. I have a more philosophical question. I'm going to spend a paragraph making a statement, and then I'll ask my question, which is, I don't drive. I live 3 miles from where I grew up. I know where my family's land is, even if it's underneath the Beltway. I know where it is. If someone came to me and said, look, here are ways you can save money on energy by doing X, Y, and Z, I'd listen to you. But it just seems to me that leftist environmentalists in general are just trying to compete about who's the most sanctimonious among them. And I will just mention the words Peter Singer and leave it at that. I would be open to a lot of green ideas, but based on a lot of reading and observing the left, I don't know if such a coalition is possible.
So, is your question then? Is it possible to make a coalition with the conventional?
I think this is a very important problem because we are discussing something which does need a consensual solution. We need to come to some kind of a negotiated solution which involves a commitment from everyone. And that's why I address the matter of ordinary people's emotions. What will make ordinary people come round to an environmental policy? And I say, well, in the end, it's their oikophilia. And you're right that people on the left don't seem, on the whole, open to negotiated solutions. They have a millenarian approach to problems. They're inspirational. God has granted them a revelation, and if you like, they're Islamist about all the things that they think about, and that does make them difficult to deal with. And we in Europe, after the war, we had the growth of quite reasonable left-wing parties in politics. The Labour Party has been, until Tony Blair came along and sort of muddled things up, it was actually a patriotic party devoted to solving things in committee and so on. And I think here you do have committees in Congress and so on where Democrats and Republicans sit down together and evolve solutions. So some of that still remains. But the problem is the activist agenda rather than the ordinary way in which people on left and right can cooperate.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Higgins with the American Meteorological Society. The idea of greenhouse gas emissions as a market failure because those who emit receive a subsidy from the broader society in the form of the atmosphere as a free dumping ground didn't come up at all. And I wonder about your thoughts of that and whether that factors into what you see as solutions.
Well, yeah, as I say, I move on from this problem because I think it hasn't got a solution given our present state of knowledge. But it's important observation you make, of course, that environmental problems, man-made, anthropogenic environmental problems, come from the rational disposition to externalize your costs. And one of the ways of doing this is finding a sink in which to put the unwanted byproduct of what you do. And as you say, the atmosphere is one of those sinks, the ocean's another one, your neighbour's garden is one as well, if you can get away with it. But normally you can't get away with it if there's some particular person who's afflicted by what you do. But when your affliction is of future generations who don't yet exist, then of course you can get away with it. That's a useful way of describing the problem, but it's not one that generates any solution, because the solution is to find a motive in the person who's doing the polluting, not to do it now. And that means finding in people living now the desire, the structure of desire, which causes them to take future generations automatically into account. That's what I think oikophilia is. You know, the sense that I am here in this place, which is not just mine but ours, and where the we is defined across generations. Finding that motive is part of what conservative politics is all about, in my view.
So, this part of the policy conference is the part where we talk about structures of desire and oikophilia and Heidegger in the original German, and we'll get into some of the grubbier aspects, I think, in the panel of,
Right.
what does this mean in terms of, although we have Mark, who is an incredibly distinguished environmental philosopher, to kind of keep things on a higher plane as well. But I think trying to sort of set the grounding here to think about this.
Well, I will add just one particular thing you did say, Roger, about the importance of the common law. There has been some thought, interestingly, by people at the Cato Institute of seemingly but not really unlikely places about would you actually apply a common law structure on the global level to environmental damages from climate? And you can do some theoretical constructs for this, but it falls on the shoals of what you mentioned, which is there isn't sufficiently robust rules of law in a lot of the countries that would be involved in this to actually make it play out in practice. And so it ends as a purely theoretical exercise, because that's probably a harder problem to solve than low carbon energy, I think.
Yeah. I think, Adam, yesterday you drew my attention to some absurd law case here where somebody acting in loco parentis on behalf of the next generation of children was suing the U.S. government on the matter of climate change. This is absurd because it supposes, first of all, that the U.S. government could affect climate change on its own. And also, it identifies the victim in ways which are completely open,
right,
and can't be confined to a particular damage. So it couldn't possibly survive in a common law court.
Yeah, this case was just decided at district court just the last couple of days, and I'd read about it. And the judge's declaration is that children that are plaintiffs, but everyone has a fundamental right to a stable climate. We tried this in the 60s. We thought we could end poverty by having an injunction from a judge.
Yes.
And that judges would be better than senators, Congress, and everybody else in devising policy. I think even though that appeal will be heard in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, I'm skeptical of its chances of surviving.
I mean, it is comparable to the Labour Party's solution to the problem of describing the Department of Environment as the Department of Environment and Climate Change.
Right. Adam, do you want to... right there. And then...
On the question of oikophilia, this motivation in a love of home, isn't that dependent on a kind of stability, intergenerational stability, and how well would it work in a place where, like America, we're very mobile. One generation doesn't live where the previous generation lived. Certainly, I mean, we can all think of, if not ourselves, members of our family who didn't grow up where their parents grew up. How do you develop the kind of oikophilia that you're talking about that seems dependent on the English countryside model, the Ruskin model, generations of, if not farmers, at least people living in the same place? How do you get that love of
this is, for me, it's a really important question. There is, as you rightly say, the English tradition, the Ruskin model of environmental protection. I mentioned this in my book because it is a rebuke to modern environmentalists who think that they've discovered this agenda for the first time, to point out that it has been at the heart of political thinking in my country for 200 years, and is at the heart of the common law as well. But you're right that we can't simply take the rural settlement as our concept of home. That's one instance of something more general, and this is why I think it's the nature and conservation of cities which is really important. The city is the place which provides a home to mobile people. This is the place to which they come, from which they go, but to which they hope to come back, or where their children might come back. The architecture that you see from this window consists of two kinds. There's the oikophile architecture over there, and the oikophobe architecture straight across the street. The architecture with the glass front, the empty, soulless interior, which says, "I am nowhere." Whereas that over there says, "I am somewhere." And the reason why people love Washington is that because there's quite a lot of somewhere here. The famous remark of Gertrude Stein about some town.
Oakland, California.
Yeah, that's right. That there's no there. I mean, that unfortunately is true of most of America, you can remedy this problem by making a there, and then it doesn't. Then doesn't become a question of the mobility of people, but their attachment to this and their sense that there are these places which they love and which need their attention and need their care.
What's the title of your book on architecture, Roger?
The Aesthetics of Architecture. Well, there's one called The Classical Vernacular, which is perhaps more to the point. Yeah.
Right.
Hi, Jim Presswood with Earth Stewardship Alliance. And I just was curious, you talked a bit about the conservatives in the UK and how they responded to climate change. I'd just be interested in your sort of comparing and contrasting the responses of conservatives a little bit more in the UK as opposed to us here in the United States, and how it does seem like in the United States the issue has become quite polarized, especially since the 90s.
Well, what is interesting in our country is that David Cameron, before taking office, he said, the environment is at the top of my agenda. I'm going to produce a new type of conservative government which really looks into this. Then the day after taking office, someone said in the environment, oh, yeah, we'll come to that. And that actually characterized his approach to every single problem until his final recognition that he'd made the ultimate mistake of asking the people what they think. And basically they said, bugger off. But interestingly, though, the Labour Party has dropped it also from its agenda. There isn't someone like Jeremy Corbyn. He would, of course, go along with the environmental agenda insofar as it's an attack on big business, multinationals, the Western Alliance, and all those other evil things. But there is no policy there. Nothing about what we should be preserving and what we should be changing and how we confront the clean energy problem and all that. It's just not there.
Hasn't Corbyn talked about bringing back coal miners' jobs?
So there's that.
Right,
yeah.
which is kind of ironic.
Absolutely. He doesn't specify what jobs, though. They could be, making crayons or,
Right. Gentleman right here in front.
Good morning. My name is Daniel. I'm from Marin County, California.
Aha.
So it seems to me that the environmentalist approach to this problem is very idealistic, and we saw what idealism did to us in the 20th century. And my question is, what would be a path to stay away from idealism and think more realistic?
Yeah. Well, that's the essence of the problem. I agree. How to get realistic approaches rather than idealistic approaches, and it connects with the question that the gentleman here raised about how do you secure cooperation from idealists or from people who are in the grip of an idea. And my view is you probably can't. That a realistic solution has to be a negotiated one. And it has to be imperfect, because we are imperfect. It has to be open to adjustment as you go along as well. One of the problems, if we look back at the 20th century, one of the problems of the leftist solutions as to the social existence that then were entertained is that they had no reverse gear, no plan B, and no way of adjusting to the difficulties that they cause. And I think that is the most important thing, that any solutions must themselves be adaptable, so that if they're going wrong, you revisit them. And thinking of the Ostrom examples of these small communities that manage their environment successfully, they do it partly because when it's going wrong, they can quickly make an adjustment, and that's how we live. But bureaucratic solutions, on the whole, are very slow to make adjustments. If you think of what the Environmental Protection Agency has done with air pollution here, the impossibility, the difficulty it has of adjusting to the fact that there are side effects of their policies which they didn't want, and so on. So, yeah, it's a matter of establishing a habit of negotiation which involves us all. And that's really what I think oikophilia helps us to do.
We have time for one more question. Maybe I'll squeeze in two. You gentlemen right here.
Thanks. Good morning again. I'm Kareem Farhad. I'm a PhD graduate from Stanford. I just moved to DC. So I have 3 points. I'm going to make them very quickly. I have a technical point, then I have a philosophical question, which I know less about because I'm an engineer. And then I have a practical question. So the technical point is about wind energy. I heard you talking about the 20%, but I was a little bit confused about that because as far as I know, you can basically generate as much energy as you want. You can basically fill the whole grid with wind energy if you have wind and if you have the good, basically technology to combine it with other resources and basically buffer it and make it good for the grid. But it's totally possible. It doesn't have to stop at 20%. Random statistic, cats eat more birds than wind farms actually kill birds. So again, when we're talking about environmental consequences, how do we think about that? So this is the technical comment. The philosophical question is, I heard you talking about the environment and the climate. And I am interested to hear your thoughts about the distinction between both, because I can easily see how someone can easily recognize a problem in their immediate environment. Like you see a plastic bottle, you pick it up and you put it in a trash can. But when you're talking about the climate, it's not that easy for people to understand what the climate is. They can't see it, they can't react to it. So from that perspective, I can totally see how individuals and small communities can act on environment, but how can we tackle something like climate without a globalization aspect to it? And the last part of that question is, what is your opinion about the Paris Agreement?
Right. You may be right that one could amplify the products of wind farms beyond the 20%, though the Danes and the Germans have both found that that is where it stops, partly because wind is a rare commodity. Every now and then, of course, you get some really nice flow of air across Europe, but it very quickly becomes too much. So the turbine has to be stopped, or it just dies down to nothing. So, and then, as you say, you have to have other resources to fill in the gap, and so it seems that those other resources have proved themselves to be necessary, coal or nuclear, as then your second point, which I think is absolutely right, you can't present the climate problem in the same way as you can the plastic problem, which is essentially the one that I was contrasting with it, because the plastic problem is a problem in your immediate environment which challenges you as a citizen to do something. So we do have to have a global solution. But my view is that a global solution cannot be achieved by treaty, given the present state of our knowledge and our resources, and the manifest interest that countries like India and China have in getting as much energy as they can by the methods that we presently have. So we have to have a scientific solution which enables us to produce cheap energy which can be made available to developing countries. But then we might be able to think about a reasonable treaty. So that answers your third question. I think the Paris Agreement is a load of nonsense, because it's committing us to something that we can't provide.
Yeah, the German thing is interesting, but I can talk to you during the break about that a bit. Lady, have the last question here, and then we'll go to a break.
Hi, I'm Serena Lecko. I work with the American Meteorological Society. I have a question about what you said about the need to create a sense of there in a place like the U.S. I guess I would just wonder who sort of has the power and agency to create that sense of there, because obviously everyone in a given society doesn't have that power. So I guess what gives someone the agency to have the power to exclude?
I think it's a very interesting question that this underlines the fact that a free economy in which freedom is emphasized before as a higher value than any controls does have a tendency to void communities of any central any center that is of their identity. The flight to the suburbs has been observed everywhere in America, and the dereliction of the centre of the city as a result. So it's not going to be easy to achieve. We in Europe, of course, never had any problem in achieving centralized, centripetal cities where people flow into the center, because we hate each other so much that we have to build walls around the cities and people move into the center spontaneously to get away from all the fire that's been thrown over the walls. And that's how the beautiful cities of Europe began. But they also began not just from protecting yourself, but also inviting God into the center. There'd be a cathedral or whatever around which the houses are piled up in beautiful little alleyways. You don't have that in America, although you do have some great cities which have become centripetal because the economy has drawn people into the center, and because there are natural boundaries like New York or San Francisco, which are cities which do have a real sense of place and where people want to belong. What you have to produce is the motive to live downtown. I've just been traveling around Oklahoma looking for that motive unsuccessfully. So, and Americans, because of their sense that the owner of property is the absolute sovereign over what he possesses, don't like the kind of regulations that we have in Europe, which say you've got to build along the street, you've got to have a facade of this kind, height limit, this degree, etc. So, and it could be that something in the American attitude would have to change in order for there to be a there.
So your line about part of the success of European cities is the fact that we have these historical hatreds. That gives me hope, because
you stole that from me,
the step
Steve.
increase in polarization delivered to us by Donald Trump means we might revitalize the cities. Who would have thought? We're going to take about a 10 to 15 minute break and then reconvene with a panel, and then we'll have lots more audience participation in this next segment. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
So this will be a little bit of a come down from the ontologies of being and Heidegger and whatever, but we're going to try to get, if not sort of nitty gritty, because I think obviously everything's very open right now, but we're going to try to also ground some of Sir Roger's very helpful comments from this morning's session, and kind of talk about maybe what some of this might mean in a more practical, near-term sense, and folks here reflect on their experiences. So I'm going to turn it back over to Steve, who will offer some introductory comments.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for sticking around after our flight into metaphysics. We thought for this, what we're calling a roundtable portion, that we'd try to do something genuinely interdisciplinary and come at this question from a whole different variety of perspectives and disciplines and so forth and expertises. Just very quickly, I'm going to name our panel here, and then I'll describe who they are a little bit more fully in order as we go down the line for opening comments. Our first speaker here to my immediate right is Professor Mark Sagoff of George Mason University, author of many fine books on environmental subjects and philosophy. I'll come back to Mark in a minute and give you the particular reason why I wanted him to be here. Jeremy Carl, of course, from Hoover, has neglected to mention that he is also the director of the Schultz-Stevenson Task Force on Energy Policy at Hoover, which does a lot of fine programs on, you might say, the cutting edge of what might be possible in energy technology and energy policy. Carlin Bowman, to his right, is a specialist in public opinion analysis at the American Enterprise Institute. Produces, among many other reports on public opinion surveys, a report about once or twice a year on environmental public opinion. And then finally, at the end, Brent Fuel is the founder of the Earth and Water Group. He's an attorney. He's worked at the EPA, and more about that in a moment. So let me give a little bit more detail here. There was about a year or I guess 2 years ago now, a group of what I, for lack of a better term, call reform-minded environmentalists, or maybe you might say environmentalists with second thoughts, conventional environmentalists, if I can use that phrase, produced what they called the Ecomodernist Manifesto. And I can say you can find the Ecomodernist Manifesto at the website ecomodernist.org, except it's down right now for some reason, which is a little ironic for a group that is pro-technology. But you can find it lots of places. It's a wonderful document. It eschews Malthusianism, which was always kind of the core of 70s era environmentalism. It's pro-economic growth, especially for the developing world. Pro-technology, which many precincts of environmentalism have not always been. And one of the signatories and authors of the document was Professor Sagoff. And I think it was either he or one of the other authors asked me one time, do you think conservatives might be interested in eco-modernism? And I said, well, maybe. There's just one problem with the name, or two problems with the name. It has the word eco in it, and it has the word modern in it. Other than that, it looks great. So, Professor Sagoff, would you go ahead and give us a few words about eco-modernism and whatever other opening thoughts you'd like to share?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You can stay there if you want.
No,
Oh, you want to come up here? Okay.
I think I won't be as hunched over. Okay. I'm always hunched over, so I need a chance not to be hunched over.
I should add, by the way, Steve, you forgot.
Well, this is a fantastic opportunity. I've been a follower and admirer of Roger Scruton as a philosopher for, we're coevals, but for longer than most of you have been alive. And the first book I read was Art and Imagination. It was really, it just exerted a fantastic influence on me. So the frontispiece of Art and Imagination, which was your first book back in the 70s. The frontispiece, probably may not remember, was Durer's Rhinoceros. That's a 1515 woodcut. I don't think Albert Durer had ever seen a rhinoceros. It was, but he had a fascination and love for this kind of explicit mystery that pictures had come to him from India. And it's that kind of love which combines our own artistic imagination with a sense of our commitment to the natural world that I think that unites a lot of Roger Scruton's writing, and I'm very grateful for so much that you've done. Now, as you said, Steve Hayward asked me to talk something about ecomodernism, and in response to Scruton's admirable presentation. So there is a recently published Ecomodernist manifesto, and I am co-author, and it has a lot to say about how society will be able to protect the natural environment. The best way to protect nature on this account is to use it less, depend upon it less, and to rely more on technology to support human needs, as if that weren't already happening, which it is. Nature unused, ecomodernists say, in that document, is nature spared. So it's very anti-Malthusian. It talks about all the technologies as we switch from a good society to a digital. It's all of that, and the promise of nuclear energy, and you get the point. But where it's silent, however, or more silent than it should be, and where Roger Scruton has been most helpful, is on the question of what kind of nature do we want to spare, and why do we want to spare it? So let's say we're all technological optimists here, so we can take a lot of the pressure off nature by using less land to produce more food. You know the ritual. So why would we care? What is this nature we care about? And therefore, why do we want to spare it? And part of the critique of ecomodernism has been to say that, along with everybody else, there is no baseline, historical baseline, to where conservationists want to take us back. Human beings have influenced everything. There's no place that is, outside of the effects of human activity. You all know that. So where is this nature that we are supposed to be protecting? And I think this is just what scrutinizes in the Ocophilia idea. Now, what I want to do in my remaining 8 minutes is to talk a little bit about theology, which is and science. Okay, well that's enough. Theology concerns the relationship between human beings and God, and human beings to each other as children of God. For the conservationist movement, The question has been the relationship between human beings to nature, and in that way to God and to each other. So somehow God existed in the natural world, and environmentalists, classical environmentalists, and starting from John Muir and in the 70s, while still remaining secular and not endorsing any particular faith, those who advocated the conservation of nature in the heyday of preservationism, culminating in the Wilderness Act of 1964, they all regarded nature as spiritual. They spoke of caring for creation, even though they rarely, if ever, endorsed the view that nature exists as a result of divine decree. I mean, these environmentalists are not creationists. And yet the notion of caring for the whole spirituality of creationism has informed their program. Now the problem here is the oneness they attributed to nature has to do with this simplifying and unifying spirituality. Although biology is nothing like that. I mean, there's no such thing as biodiversity. There are places with different kinds of species undergoing different kinds of histories. But in the 1900s, there was this notion that nature is all one because God is one and God created nature. And I think Ecomodernism is, from my point of view, an attack on or a critique on that notion of the oneness of nature. In many religions, especially those that predate Christianity, there was a diversity of gods, with each with a particular power or aspect in the world. There was the god of the sun, of the moon, of the sea, of the wind, of the harvest, and so on. By the way, this is the time to see the god of the moon. I mean, we're having the perigee. It's going to be the biggest supermoon tonight in 70 years, I believe. So, you go there and say, oh, sure, I mean, that's Diana, it's the god of the moon. But anyway, in the pre-Christian societies had lots of gods. I mean, Greek mythology, trees had dryads, the Buddhist tradition, forests had guardian spirits, or gnats, as they call it. As historian Frederick Turner has written, in fact, before the coming of Christianity, all peoples of the old world had lived in a numinous landscape, believed to be under the protection of guardian spirits. So instead of having one nature under some kind of biological laws of evolution, which has been the mantra of traditional environmentalism based on a monotheism in Christianity, you could think of, I think, much more consistent with your view, of many places, each with his own guardian spirits. And what Roger Scruton, I think, says, we have to be those guardian spirits of the places we love and know. And that's just a thought I'm going to finish with and continue with. When God became one, nature became one. The difference monotheism made with respect to the environment was this. Nature became singular. It answered to the same divinity or creative force that then was taken over in ecology and simply secularized. It expressed the same cosmic idea or power. It represented the same unseen order. It resulted from the same expressive act. William James had talked about religion. Two conditions of religion is that nature has an unseen order, and second, there is something wrong about us as we initially stand. So both environmentalism and Christianity became kind of the same religion because there's an unseen order, which the ecologists say, you give us enough money, we'll find out, how nature works or something. And there's something wrong with you because you're polluting or you're disturbing or you're disrupting ecosystems. So that's just a religious, but it's taken over from Christianity as a secular gloss on it. The 16th century Protestant theologian John Calvin referred to nature as a sort of mirror in which we contemplate God, who is otherwise invisible. that nature expresses one God and is therefore unitary, singular, at odds with man, who consumes and corrupts it, is the familiar trope of conservationism. As historian Raymond Williams has written, even men who were prepared to dispense with the first singular principle, to dispense with the idea of God, usually retained and emphasized the other and very comparable principle, the singular and abstracted nature. The idea that nature is fundamentally all one place, all one biodiversity, all Gaia, everything connects. The idea that nature is all one place, expressive of God, became secularized in the 19th century Romanticism, Transcendentalism, which are, of course, the antecedents of conservationism. A romantic poet such as Wordsworth and a transcendentalist essayist such as Emerson did not profess a god of any particular creed. Wordsworth found in nature the types and symbols of eternity, and as he wrote in a prelude, nature is a symbol of spirit, according to that. All of this idealizes nature and removes it, actually, from our experience, except in our grant proposals to funding agencies for technical work in modeling ecosystems, that sort of thing. The existence of a prelapsarian state of the world, oh, we have 2 more paragraphs. Right? The existence of a prelapsarian state of the world that comprises natural ecosystems or communities which are thought to respond to universal principles which scientists theorize, and then eventually, once we understand the laws by which ecosystems work, that government agencies can enforce them or something like that. This is the foundational assumption of a prominent, perhaps dominant view in ecology, according to which nature and humanity represent opposing global controllers or opposing strategies of development. Paul Robbins and Sarah Moore identify research that adopts this nature-culture antagonism in what these authors call the Edenic sciences, understood to include, among others, conservation biology, restoration ecology, and invasion biology, as well as theoretical ecology overall. They say, these sciences share a tacit epistemological commitment to evaluating ecological relationships explicitly with regard to an a priori baseline, a condition before the Columbian encounter, or a time before human contact, or a place of expulsion of no return, like expulsion for which we cannot return. Something like before the fall. It is an absolute Christian notion of a pre-lapsarian state. Of course, in Christian theology, nature fell with man, but this is the secularized version, it doesn't. What has aesthetic importance or value involves the contingencies, just as Roger Scruton. It's not these generalities. It's the particularities and the contingencies, like that rhinoceros, trying to find in the world things that we can revere and perceive and commune with. And these are places as well as rhinoceroses. As the anthropologist Clifford Geertz has written, for all the, we went back to Oakland, and there's no there, and people traveling around. And Geertz says something very helpful about this. He says, for all the uprooting, the homelessness, the migrations, forced and voluntary, the dislocations of traditional relationships, the struggles over homelands, borders, rights of recognition, for all the destructions of familiar landscapes and the manufacturing of new ones, which Roger Scruton above all has described, for all the loss of stabilities of local originalities, the sense of place and the sense of place and of the specificities of places, like looking out the window, the specificities of places seems, however tensed and darkened, barely diminished in the modern world. That's a very hopeful statement. Last paragraph. When Jonathan Edwards, as an undergraduate at Yale, wandered the woods near New Haven to find faint images, early 18th century, to find faint images of what he called shadows of divine things. When Walt Whitman wended, his word, the shores of Long Island to come to terms with mortality, when William Wordsworth toured the lake country to get his impulse from the vernal wood, when Ralph Waldo Emerson hiked Acton Woods to commune with the oversoul, and when Thoreau traveled widely in Concord to learn what he could do without, they did not, as is commonly thought, experience nature, capital N, a singular unitary place between God and man. They all walked in completely different places. It is the difference among species and places, the ways they change over time, and the expressive significance of our relationship to them that makes them individually objects of moral experience and therefore of moral and aesthetic worth. That is what I have taken, I hope appropriately, from Roger Scruton's writing from the original Art and Imagination, one of my favorite books, to his work on conservation today. Thank you for giving me this chance.
Believe it or not, Carlin Bowman, I know you won't believe this, I can actually connect what he said to what you're going to say. I'm that good. Let me tell you just a bit about how I first met Jeremy Carl, because it's a fun story, I think. It was, 10 years ago maybe, I wrote an obituary on National Review Online for an environmentalist I had known very well out in California named Tom Graff, who was the West Coast director of the Environmental Defense Fund. And somebody who in the late 80s, early 90s, I did a lot of work with on water conservation, water supply issues in California. And not only was he atypical for what you think of someone from the environmental establishment, he was sort of utterly non-ideological, and it was especially fun when he attacked California's moderately conservative Governor Pete Wilson from the right. I mean, I first called him up one day when I saw him in the press saying, you know, Pete Wilson's approaching this problem of water the way you'd expect Gorbachev to do it. Gorbachev was still alive. I thought, this guy's interesting, right? So I printed this and thought, you know, it's not often you see an article in National Review praising someone from Environmental Defense Fund, and I got an email from someone with a Hoover Institution email address, and it was Jeremy Carl saying, I knew Tom too. What a fabulous guy, one of my favorite guys. And so we struck up a friendship over that. As I mentioned briefly, Jeremy is the director of the Schultz-Stevenson Task Force on Energy Policy. They do a lot of fine programs out at Hoover. I could say a lot of things about Jeremy and the idea and energy. I'll just say this about energy. It obviously is connected and is at the center of the climate policy discussion. But in the spirit of our day, I've always been struck by the fact that human beings are energy-consuming beings by nature. There's actually evidence in evolutionary biology that certain changes in the size and cognitive function of the human brain coincides with mankind's development of fire, however many tens of thousands of years ago that process began, right? So it's a central subject philosophically as well as practically. And I don't know how much you want to talk about that, Jeremy, but the floor is yours. Do you want to stay there or come up here?
So thank you, Steve, and thank you, everyone. I am, as Steve sort of alluded, I'm going to get a little bit more grubby and get us out of Wordsworth and Emerson, although I do think, as much as I love Burke, and you know, everybody should read Reflections on the Revolution in France, one of my all-time favorite books. But I do think it's also kind of useful to both give a little bit of, I think, where the left went wrong philosophically, but I also want to try to ground it in, well, where does that all leave us with President-elect Trump and the sorts of things that we might do that would be a little bit different. And as even out in California, I mean, I know here in D.C. everybody kind of talks about the election probably every day, but in California, you know, all my neighbors are software developers, basically. I'm almost not exaggerating. And so they only sort of parenthetically pay attention to politics. But even they, around the election, you know, they know that I'm involved in policy. And so they start asking me, well, what do you think about this? And one of the things that I've said, and I've actually been saying this since before the convention, is actually the election of President-elect Trump here is actually quite liberating for conservative policy scholars, in that he showed that policy as a like policy papers is almost irrelevant to getting elected president, and I genuinely mean that. It's sort of exciting because there's not a sort of dogma in terms of things. Obviously he said some things, and he's been specific about some issues that he's cared about. But there's not kind of like a paint by numbers thing we have to do. And I mean, look, I wrote a 40-page detailed dive into energy policy for another candidate who did not win this election on the Republican side, and it got all sorts of wonderful full press and praise. And at the end of the day, that was that, and the check that nicely cashed for me was about all that came out of it. And so there's probably a lesson about that about modern politics for us. But I think it gives a tremendous opportunity for those of us on the right to kind of be able to shape some things in interesting ways, and not just to kind of reset from a lot of the things that the left are doing that we disagree with for reasons that I think Sir Roger touched on philosophically, but also maybe ways that we've been hidebound in the past. So I combine that, and I'd also say the other really appealing aspect of a Trump presidency is this is the man who wrote Art of the Deal. He's a deal maker, and so I mean there's sort of two different kind of axes, right? There's sort of orthodoxy and not orthodoxy, and there's deal maker and not deal maker. And I consider myself kind of quite reactionary ideologically, but temperamentally I'm a deal maker. And so I think that also provides a great opportunity for those of us on the right as we think about some of these things. And people say, well, is Trump going to do this or that on carbon or climate? And I say, look, it's unlikely, but what's on the table? You going to repeal Roe versus Wade and get rid of the income tax? I bet you'd find a lot of takers on the right. I mean, that's obviously, I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think it's a way of saying, I think a President Trump, if in fact the administration reflects ultimately, his ideological and temperamental posturing, will be one who will be a lot more open to putting things on the table if he thinks that, hey, at the end of the day, we net a better deal for the right on that. And so I think that, that has obviously some risks that those of us who are conservatives will have to think about and guard against, that we're not ever giving away the store. But I also think that it has some interesting opportunities. So then, what does that mean? I think it's been touched upon by both of our previous speakers, this kind of romanticism that has been part and parcel of a lot of left-wing environmental thinking. And that they have been very obsessed with nature as this. Currently, nature, I think, philosophically, is basically a walled garden, right? They're almost nowhere. Maybe in some remote places in Alaska do you really have nature in the raw, right? But almost everywhere else, even our national parks, are ultimately conditioned by the fact that we have called these places parks and walled them off from everywhere else. And I think kind of, environmentalist groups, they love to kind of fundraise off this kind of notion of unspoiled or whatever. And that also implies a certain way in which people have to react to those spaces. But I don't think the right should be so constrained. And one of the things I would love to see more, because I think it leads to more appreciation of nature, is a conservative policy that provided more access to nature. We've been, under the left, really closing off a lot of our national parks and other spaces in the name of sort of a conservation, or, we're going to spoil this. And, in some cases that may be justified, but I think in a lot of cases it's kind of, experts kind of want to keep things for themselves, or they want to wall it off as kind of part of both an equilibrium state that doesn't exist as a scientific concept, and part of a steady state that also just is, these are not scientific concepts, they're ultimately romantic concepts. They owe more, and this is great tension within environmentalism, to again talk about the philosophy for a second. They sort of claim to be great inheritors of Darwin, and yet they have this very creationist view of how we must preserve like kind of this current state, to the point that we sort of fight off certain predators that we decide we don't like, right? So I think there's a lot of problems there, and I think this sort of gets into the notion that we kind of need to push back against state power, and particularly power at the federal level, and to return more local governance, the sort of communities that Sir Roger sort of picked up on in his remarks, and talking about how you create that sort of localism without kind of just being agrarian in a way that we're not today. At least most of us are not living, but I think people and localities do have a great sense of what works well for their own communities. And I think this kind of gets down to this sort of notion of place, again, that Sir Roger talked about. I've traveled all over the world to 60, 70 countries, I don't know. If you were to ask me to pick my favorite place in terms of just pure aesthetic, I would probably say the Hunza Valley in Pakistan, which probably not too many people here have been to, but trust me, it's really quite beautiful. But if you ask me, do I get to pick between that and Yosemite? Well, Yosemite's in my backyard. I mean, that's mine in the way that the Hunza Valley isn't. And kind of when we think about Trump, who I think is ultimately a nationalist at heart, and that sort of one nation kind of view really pervaded a lot of what he's thinking, I think orienting environmentalism and environmental thought within a kind of nationalist framework is both correct philosophically, and I think it can get some allies that have not been there previously. And it's interesting. I mean, I was once talking with some folks in the Israeli environmental community. I can't remember under what context. And one of the things they were saying, that's a place in Israel where kind of land nationalism, as you might imagine, plays a big role. Some of the most conservative Israeli politicians are also some of the most strong folks on a conservation ethic within Israel, because there's that attachment to the land. And I think that's something that we can develop in a nationalistic way here in the US, and that fits very well with the kind of thinking of the current administration. I think this has implications for immigration policy, something which the administration has more than a passing interest in. And the sort of notion of a kind of like the open borders that have pervaded the left, it's never been clear to me why my consumption is something that needs to be very, very carefully metered. But if I bring somebody from a very low consumption environment into a very high resource use environment like the US, well, that doesn't count. And the best I can figure out why that doesn't count is because the left doesn't like that. I mean, there's really no empirical reason why that shouldn't count. So I think kind of bringing those sorts of things into the environmental debate, and frankly, it's a good way. There's a great fish on the left, and they've always been tamping down. Whenever these things are put to the Sierra Club membership, there's sort of a third of folks who are pretty hardcore skeptics of the sort of mass immigration policies that the Democrats have put, despite the fact that the leadership is always trying to just get in bed with the Democrats on it. I think there's some interesting opportunities there, without getting into the specifics of what we might do to make some interesting new coalitions. I mean, there's all sorts of things we could do with various acts, but I don't want to take up too much time here up front. But I think we can devolve a lot of powers to the state. I would love to see the EPA get out of the business of, I'd like to put Congress back in charge of legislating, and EPA much more in charge of monitoring and implementing, which I think was really the purpose of the EPA in the first place. So, I mean, I think that's just in general, putting these resources and these decisions closer to local communities, I think is a great opportunity, which doesn't mean weakening protections. It may mean strengthening protections at times, but it means letting those decisions be made by folks who are closer to them. And I think kind of going into that principle of subsidiarity, and to understand that there isn't a one-size-fits-all opportunity. And I think this kind of, within that broad context, a sort of one-nation environmentalism or environmental ethic could be something that would be a very interesting thing to develop as a de novo thing as we look forward to the next 4 years. So with that, I'll thank you.
So Professor Sagoff gave us a very elegant, history lesson of sort about how, environmental sensibility descends in certain ways and takes on a spiritual cast from the secularization of Christianity. That's a crude way of summarizing it, I think. But where I'm going with all that is, what can live by secularization can die by secularization. And I've been wondering for a while whether the fervency of environmental sentiment has not dissipated and perhaps past the point now where it no longer has that spiritual fervency that it had, say, back in the 70s. I remember the first Earth Day. That leads me to Carlin Bowman, believe it or not. I can remember, if you're in political history, in 1998, the issue was, it was sort of centered on the left, but was still contested for. Many people may remember Vice President Bush effectively attacking Governor Dukakis for the pollution in Boston Harbor. Great piece of political mischief in theater. And then when President Clinton and Al Gore ran for re-election in 1996, their theme, their refrain, they said over and over and over and over, you got sick of it, was We're here to protect Medicare, Medicaid, education, and the environment. Now, I suggest that it takes an electron microscope to find the role of the environment as an issue in the election cycle just completed, with the conspicuous exception of Donald Trump rubbishing all the standard views on climate change and saying we're just going to get rid of all that, for which he apparently paid no political cost and for which he seemed to attract very few attacks from his opponent or from the press or from anywhere. This is astonishing to me at least. And so, as I so often do when I'm mystified by public opinion, I call Carlin Bowman, and she always has the answer. And so I guess one of the questions, Carlin, is sort of unpack that for us. What is the state of public? I'll just give you a roundhouse opening question. You can take any way you want. How do you analyze and assess the state of American public opinion on the environment today? And do you want to stay there or come up here? Whatever you like. That's fine.
Thanks, Steve. And it's a real pleasure to be here today. Pollsters are not very popular these days. We didn't have a particularly good week last week. And I should also say it's just a great pleasure always to hear Roger, and that was real treat this morning. You're absolutely correct. The environment was a non-issue in this campaign, and a question that Gallup asked that they began asking in 1935. There are hundreds of soundings on this question. They updated it in late September. They asked, what's the most important problem facing the country today? Again, hundreds of soundings on this question. 1% mentioned the environment. 33% mentioned the economy and jobs. But there are many other indicators that the position of the environment as a most important problem for Americans have changed dramatically. Alexander Aston out at UCLA has been asking entering college freshmen since 1964 about things that they'll be active in when they graduate from college. And as you can imagine, as Steve suggested, in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, a lot of young people said they were going to be involved in environmental cleanup. That's a trace element right now. But to put this in another perspective, I want to just report on the results of a question that Pew asked in the last 2 weeks of the election campaign. And they asked about what would be major problems for the next president to face. And there's a very long list of concerns, and I'll just quickly go through them for you. Drugs was at the top of the list, 58%, followed by terrorism, 56%, followed by the income gap, 54%, jobs, 53%, guns, 50%, immigration, 40%, crime, 40%, climate change, 40%, roads, 39%, racism, 36%, and sexism, 21%. So very close to the bottom of the list overall. Well, why is that? The environment emerged as an issue in public policy in a very unusual way in terms of public opinion. It's very rare for an issue that's not salient or central to emerge full-blown as the issue did in the late 1960s and early 1970s. We all became environmentalists at that point, in part because I think we were concerned about the things Roger was talking about, our homes, our neighborhoods overall. When a value becomes seen as essential, when we all agree on it, rich, poor, young, old, black, white, it's a consensual value now in public opinion, we tend to pull away from the issue overall. We, in a kind of backhanded compliment to representative democracy, we think that the various factions in Washington fighting over major environmental issues will come to good policy judgments. We're not going to be involved. We're going to get involved once again in things in our neighborhoods, our homes, and our communities where we really feel we can make a difference. The public rarely ever gives specific legislative advice. Americans talk in terms of general values, and the things that concern them most are things in their own communities overall. So the environment, again, for that very rare period between 1968 and 1973 was one of the top issues in policy. We saw the Cuyahoga River on fire, I remember that, and there were just many other local concerns. Now, that isn't to say that a politician can be anti-environment. There's no question about that, but I think the consensus is such that we've moved on as a society. That isn't true at the local or the state level, where there are deep disagreements about correct environmental policies. And this goes back as far as the spotted owl versus jobs, or protecting a particular environmental species, or protecting a particular species versus a residential development project overall. Those kinds of issues are enormously potent in public opinion. The one that we saw obviously in this campaign was Flint, Michigan, and the water supply. So again, the issue has changed its overall orientation, and I think that that's very important overall. We've agreed on these ends that environmental policy should serve. That doesn't happen, I don't think, on any other issues. And this one was so unusual because if you look at the entire body of survey literature from, let's say, 1935 to 1965, there's not a single question about the environment. The only questions in the public opinion literature, which was a pretty vibrant profession back then, were questions about, let's say, whether you wanted to use paper or glass for milk cartons, but those were sanitation issues. They weren't environmental issues. And so just a very unusual change overall. Today, only about 14% of Americans say that they're active in the environmental movement. A plurality suggests that they're sympathetic but not active. About a small number say that they're neutral, and only about 10% say that they're actually anti the environmental movement overall. So again, an issue without a great deal of impact at this particular time. I think the environment at the national level can become an issue again when and only if the public feels that there's a threat to that consensual value, to the ends that we've agreed on. We saw this during the Reagan administration with Jim Watt and Ann Gorsuch Burford at EPA. At that point, a lot of Americans thought that these people threatened the environmental consensus, and it rose to the national level again. We haven't seen that since, but given the stories that I've been reading, the early stories about some of the people who might be on the Trump team overall, I can sense that the environmental movement will try to do that once again. The environmental movement didn't have a very good election year, the dirty dozen that they've been looking at for so many election cycles overall. Only 4 of the 12 were defeated, and those were people we all expected to be defeated for another reason, not because of their environmental policy concerns overall. And again, the issue was just not a central one in Campaign 26. So it's good.
So, sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but to summarize very crudely and overstate it.
Yeah.
American people aren't that worked up about the environment. A lot of people don't care. It's the perfect time for conservatives to want to take it up.
Yes, exactly. Well, exactly.
That'd be the perfect timing, just the way we ought to do it, right?
Yeah.
Our final panelist for this morning to give opening remarks is Brent Fuel, I mentioned, founder of the Earth and Water Group. It's a law firm, worked as an attorney at the EPA. So he has the practitioner's insight, which is what I wanted to ask him about today. So now we're going from philosophy, metaphysics, down to someone who actually works in the field, works with real issues. But I do want to add, though, before queuing you up, Brent, he also is the proprietor of a group blog, or group website, I guess I should say, that I highly recommend called conservefuel.org. But if you look up fuel, F-U-E-L, you won't find it. It's Conserve Fuel, as his name is spelled, F-E-W-E-L-L. So Conserve Fuel, which is kind of clever, conservefuel.org. I highly recommend it. It's got a lot of authors who write for it, whose names you'll recognize. And Brent, do you want to stay there?
Great.
Up here?
Yeah, I'm going to stay here.
Okay.
Steve, thank you. So it's great to be here today. A few years ago, just a story about Roger. When Steve introduced me to Roger and his book, I naturally took the book home and in the privacy of my den started reading it, and I found myself actually standing up and cheering, saying, "Woohoo! We've got a conservative who's saying the right things. This is awesome!" My girls thought I was crazy, but I was just ecstatic when Roger, you wrote your book, and I've promoted it at any chance that I can get. I am not a philosopher. I am not an economist. I am a practitioner. I fix things, and I love to do that. So I'm going to talk just briefly about what is possible with the Trump administration. I spent 3 years at EPA in the Office of Water with Ben Grumbles. Some of you know Ben Grumbles, and then also Rick Otis is back here. But Rick is back over there. But it's a wonderful place with a wonderful mission. But it is also a perhaps misguided and mismanaged agency that really needs strong leadership. Let me also just say that I think after the election, I think there's this temptation to kind of overreach and react. And I would just caution the party, my colleagues, not to overreach, because I don't think that's what the American public wants. I would also encourage all of us that care about environmental issues. I got my start as a wildlife manager working in Yellowstone on the Wolf Reintroduction Project and was out there as a scientist. And just quick story, that ended up actually delaying my appointment to the Bush administration. I had no idea that, I understood the politics of the wolf project out there, but to me I was a biologist. I was doing what naturally a biologist would do to look at the introduction of the wolf, how it would react, how the elves would, the elk population and wildlife would respond to the reintroduction of the wolves. But it really made me realize the politics, how politics have divided us so terribly on environmental issues. And the blog that I set up, and Jim Presswood is a blogger on it, and also Rick and others, Tracy Meehan, and some great thinkers on this issue. It really made me realize how the left has used environmental issues as a real wedge issue, pure political wedge issue. And I would caution us as conservatives and Republicans not to make environmental stewardship a political issue. For me, it's a bipartisan issue. The politics and the policies themselves may be political, but environmental stewardship and caring about environmental issues and doing wise stewardship, to me, is not about politics. We heard. I have two teen daughters, and my life's worldviews are often formed by them, and my walk with my retriever in the woods. But the young kids actually, might not call themselves environmentalists, but they care very much about sustainability and of compassion and passion. It's really interesting. They care about environmental issues. And I would just note the whole issue of environmental justice. I know, in conservative circles, you hear the concept of environmental justice. If you go to EPA, it's a real big issue. And you'll see industry and conservatives recoil at times on the issue of environmental justice. But environmental justice is it's many things. It's socioeconomics, it's disparate environmental impacts. But then I'll raise the question, well, what's so wrong about stopping sewage overflows and backups in homes in certain parts of the communities and in poor parts of communities? What is so wrong about trying to help those people that cannot help themselves? So, and I think as a conservative, we had to care about these things. And I think there's so oftentimes a reaction or an overreaction to what the left often, is pushing out there as political theater and political agenda. I think there oftentimes are kernels of truth that conservatives should care about. One last point, Steve. I do think that my concern over the years as a conservative and kind of the reaction to environmental issues, it's created this huge void, this vacuum in the regulatory world that Republicans have not had a proactive response, an agenda on environmental issues. And I think it's created the natural response of filling that void with big government solutions. And I'll end on just this anecdote. I call it the bureaucratization of environmentalism. And I live in a small community in Rockville, Maryland, Montgomery County, which is very liberal. Love my liberal friends. But I often say, and Steve, I know you talk about too, liberals love the environment almost to death at times. We've got this small community with a green space, a beautiful little creek that runs through it. And we've got culverts there, and the culverts were in disrepair, and the board of the community for many years had gone out illegally, and I was on the board, and they would just dump concrete and go in there and muck around in the stream without permits. And I was at EPA at the time, and they came and said, we need to fix this. And I said, well, you need to get permits. I said, we put people in jail for doing that stuff without permits. And they said, okay, we'll do it the right way. But what happened and transpired after that, I think, is really telling. It took the bridge itself, to take the culvert out, the bridge itself was only about $20,000. It took another $100,000 in 2 years to get all the permits and approvals needed, not just by EPA and the Corps of Engineers, but by the local government. After the 5th review of a forestry plan where we took down 3 or 4 scrub trees at the cost of $10,000 to do this review, people start saying, why are we doing this? And they came to me and they basically said, listen, maybe you should step off the board and we'll handle this ourselves. And the problem goes to incentives and disincentives. So often, I think that environmental regulations that are put in place with such great enthusiasm and intention end up having the opposite effect and forcing people to make decisions that they may not otherwise make. So, I think there's an opportunity for us in this administration. You hear President-elect Trump talking about pragmatic, solution and problem solving, and I think we have a real chance to do that. But we should not be under any illusion. I think there's going to be strong resistance to that in D.C. with these environmental groups that see these solutions as a threat to what they have so long used as a political wedge against conservatism. So, on that note, Steve, I'll stop.
Although I'm going to want you to follow up on one particular point. I'll just add that your story about the culverts in your neighborhood reminds me of a story I know of Sam Sebastiani of the Sebastiani wine family. And when he started a new vineyard, he wanted to restore a historic wetland that had been filled in 100 years ago.
Yep.
Took him 2 years, $100,000 to get the permits to do it.
Absolutely.
You would think Republicans or conservatives would at least have the wit to say, why don't we get the government out of the way of environmental improvement?
Yes.
Right? That's kind of. But I'd like you to say a little bit more. I think it's a little more interesting than just that about the wolf business. Because I think you know the story, and I'm not sure everyone here does. And it's really the role of Hank Fisher and Defenders of Wildlife in an unconventional way. Well, this goes back 20 years now, right? And, the ecological logic of wolf reintroduction was very sound.
It was.
However, you had the typical political conflicts of the ranchers saying, but they're going to be a threat to my livestock. Right. And a lot of the environmentalists and people here in Washington said, imposed solution, as Roger puts it, right? It's, because there is certain elements of malice towards ranchers who people think shouldn't be there. And then steps Hank Fisher, and I think you probably know or involved in that story. Would you tell that a little bit?
Yeah, and you can fill in the facts, but and correct me if I'm wrong. But there was a sense that if ranchers did lose their cattle to wolves, it was the fair thing in order to replace and reimburse the rancher for those losses. If I remember correctly, the idea of funding was there, but it never came through. Is that correct, Steve?
I mean, like federal funding, or
no,
right?
Federal funding, but also
right, no funding, and it would have been bureaucratic and difficult, and
absolutely
slow, and the usual.
So there just became this huge, political kerfluffle, if you will, and real resistance by the locals out there to the wolf introduction. And I appreciate that. I mean, you have a livelihood, and you have family, you have children, you have your cattle.
Yeah, we have a Montana rancher here in the room, if I can out you,
that's,
Charles.
That's
but right, yeah.
There we go.
Okay,
absolutely.
Right.
I was viewed as the wolf in sheep's clothing coming into the Bush administration, and it delayed my appointment for close to a year, because there was a concern that I was somehow liberal because I actually was out in Yellowstone working on the wolf reintroduction project, which I was out there as a biologist and someone who cared about environmental stewardship and balance. So that's exactly right. Yeah, it did. So
right. But along came Hank Fisher, Defenders of the local chapter Defenders of Wildlife, and he says, "Look, forget the government trying to have a political process that's centralized, bureaucratized. Defenders of Wildlife will indemnify any rancher who loses a cow or sheep, at market value, and he doesn't, there wasn't a high threshold of proof, not those forms to fill out, check with headquarters. He said he could raise money for that all day long, and they paid out, I think, several $100,000 in the last 20 years.
They did. That's correct.
And that, most of the farmers, they might not have been entirely ranchers, maybe not entirely happy, but here's something that defused the politics of it, decentralized it in all the right ways.
Yeah.
Now maybe it's not replicable in many ways, but I think that's an interesting one.
Can I share another story?
Sure.
So this was the death of the Good Samaritan. So when I was at EPA, some of you may remember this, Trout Unlimited came to Ben Grumbles and me in the Office of Water, and they said, we have this watershed in Utah that's impacted, impaired by a 200-year-old, 150-year-old abandoned hard rock mine. It's leaching, toxins and pollutants, and we want to restore it for a rare cutthroat trout species. And I started to ask questions. We've got our own, Trout Unlimited had its own money. They had its own resources. The landowner there, a snowbird resort, actually was giving them access to the site to repair this impaired watershed. And I said, this is fabulous. What's the problem? And they said, well, it was Chris Wood, who's the president of Trout Unlimited at the time. He said, well, we're concerned about Superfund liability and Clean Water Act liability. If we go in there and start mucking around and fixing it, we potentially are looking at a $50 million cleanup. It's the strict liability, joint and several liability that we talk about. These laws with good intentions and good purposes have unintended consequence. And I said, perfect. We'll fix this. As a former Superfund lawyer, I said, we will issue you a friendly order super fun order that will give you indemnifications, all the protections. You go in and do what you need to do, which is simply move the tailings out of the water, redivert some of the water, and it wasn't rocket science. And so that sounds very easy. And it was one of the highlights of the Bush administration putting it out there as cooperative conservation, trying to engage more people at the local level and watershed groups to fix the problems locally and remove barriers for doing that. It took us 2 years internally at EPA to get that done, simply because of the silos within the agency and DOJ. Enforcement didn't want the Office of Water using its tools to fix this problem. Ultimately, we ended up, the administration introduced legislation. It was introduced by Senator Jim Inhofe in the House. We had a great debate. That legislation was ultimately killed, and I will tell you why. The politics played a lot in it. It wasn't until after a close friend of mine who was a senior official at EPA in the Obama administration recently basically pulled me aside afterwards confidentially and said, listen, it was great legislation. It was a wonderful idea, but there was no way in hell we were going to allow the Bush administration to have a win on environmental issues. He said it was as simple as that. And I said, thank you for confirming what I knew all the time. And I said, that's tragic, but that's exactly what happens here in D.C.
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of those stories, including the reaction to the off-road diesel rule.
Yes.
I want to come back to you in a little while, if we have time, about the King Mine fiasco in Colorado. So you can collect your thoughts on that if you want, if we have time for it. I want to go back to Carlin for a moment, and then Mark. I've been struck, Carlin, by some of the surveys that said that younger people in particular, especially over time, a lot of them say they don't consider themselves environmentalists or don't like the label. A lot of young women also say they don't like to think of themselves self-consciously as feminists. I think there's a related political aspect to that. But I wonder if, I guess the question is, are environmental groups, think of the Mainland Sierra Club, whatever, are they actually somewhat unpopular? Are they like, I'll put it this way, I remember talking some years ago to some now old members of the New Left in the 60s and 70s, and they pointed out that one of the things we didn't perceive about the anti-Vietnam War efforts was a lot of Americans were tired and didn't like the war, but they didn't like us either, right? They did because of our antics and all the rest of that. I'm wondering if a similar dynamic is happening with environmental groups. Do you have a sense of that? Is there data that bears on this?
I don't see any evidence of that, though there are not many polls in the private or the public domain that I look at that even get to these questions overall. Occasionally, you'll see a couple of groups mentioned, and they generally have favorable marks still at this point. I think for younger people, as I said, they're sympathetic, but they're not going to be active. But it is sort of in the mother's milk that they were born with. There is an environmental ethic that they've absorbed since their school years, and so they're not going to be active, and I don't think they'll be active in even the groups that may or may not be popular.
I mean, my sense from talking to students is the ones who do want to be active in the environment, it's not so much through the Sierra Club and the old line groups. They want to do different things.
That's true.
It's a little more amorphous. Yeah. Let me ask you this question, and also Mark. It's a related one, which is there a sense that the public is suffering from what I call apocalypse fatigue?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
I actually did put the question once, the one only time I met Al Gore, about, we were population bomb, resource extraction, on and on and on, the old fable of the wolf at the door. And he admitted that, yes, that's probably correct, that we overestimated some problems, but this time the wolf really is at the door. Well, okay. But the apocalypse fatigue question, you and maybe Mark, you may have some thoughts on that.
I sense that the public really is tired of a lot of this overall. We've never been particularly enthusiastic about global projects, and that's why. And I've noticed the pollsters have now taken a new tack. They're asking about climate change as a national security issue following John Kerry and President Obama. And the public's vaguely familiar with that overall, not specifically familiar at this point, but they're trying to change that conversation using the polls. But I think people really are very tired of it. And Americans are still remarkably optimistic about technology being able to fix things going forward. One of the big survey firms asked me if I'd look at a questionnaire that they were doing on climate change, and there was not a single question in the entire survey about mitigation or any of the things that might be done. And again, that just shows you, I mean, the pollsters are not a particularly political bunch or even an ideological bunch overall, but they just live in a milieu where all of their views about how you would ask survey questions come from, what they read in the New York Times and the like. They didn't even think to ask a question about technology, solving or addressing or helping to mitigate some of these problems. I just thought it was a really interesting lapse. Yeah.
Mark, do you have a comment on apocalypse fatigue or related?
Well, it certainly exists. Malthusianism is dead, gone. The limits of growth, that sort of thing from the 1970s. To rail against that or to debunk that at this point is to connive at criminal boredom. We have heard that. So,
yes, that's true.
So that if we can't move on from flogging this dead horse and saying something, more constructive, right. There's just no point in the conservative environmentalism. It's really got, ecological. First of all, it was running out of resources, but of course, we've seen the bottom of the oil barrel, said Lester Young, and Lester Brown, every single year, right? 1970s. So we haven't run out of resources, and we know the technology is what creates resources. Und so wieder. It's very well known. Then after that lost its credibility, we had ecological collapse, a totally meaningless notion. Ecological collapse has now come and gone. So the time, right now is the time to think not about beating up on these, as I say, dead horses, but creating new energies to deal with the problems we actually have.
Right. I thought I can remember the Ecomodernist Manifesto did nonetheless come in for a lot of criticism from, you might say, the old guard. Is there a generational shift underway,
Yeah.
do you think?
I don't know if it's a generational shift. I think it's just worn out its credibility.
Yeah. Jeremy, the discouraging thing from your presentation was the conclusion I scribbled down. You talk about, I wrote the policy paper that's sort of bad in the mail, right? And that would be ideas don't have consequences. That kind of puts people like you and me out of business if that's literally true. But I'll put it this way, and I wanted to ask somebody, but I'm going to ask you. 2 or 3 ways to ask this question. I'll ask it 2 ways. Has climate change eaten environmentalism alive? It just comes to dominate everything else, and every other problem is filtered through how climate change may affect species extinction, habitat, so forth, right? Disease, right? Or the other way of putting it is, wave a magic wand and as a thought experiment, and the problem of climate change goes away. Not happening, never will happen, it's fixed, whatever, however you want to conceive that as a thought experiment. How does that actually change our hierarchy of environmental problems, and what would you see as then the most important global environmental problems, or what categories would rise on that list and absorb more of our attention?
I'm going to answer the first one first because it feels a lot easier. I have to maybe I'll be able to think in the interim as I'm saying this about. But I think yes, I think climate change has to a degree sort of eaten these other environmental problems to a great extent. But I don't think that's a coincidence. In other words, I did a very negative review of, among other books, This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein about climate change, which is, by the way, before anybody tells you who read that this is just some marginal radical thinker. That's the best-selling book on climate change by far in the last couple years at least. Okay, still is #1 on Amazon. So I think this represents a lot of to the extent there's mainstream thinking. At least among activists, that's it. The book is garbage for those of you who've read it. I'm not being I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that.
It's recycled garbage, though.
It's recycled garbage. But I mean, one of the interesting things that she says, and she's right up front about it, and she kind of says, effectively, one of the few smart things she says is just because the conservatives are paranoid doesn't mean we're not out to get them. In other words, she talks about climate change as being the perfect problem. She actually quotes the former president of the Heartland Institute for doing all the things that the left wanted to do anyway. And climate change is justification for that. Centralization, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's absolutely correct. Now, I say that as not a person who's particularly skeptical about the underlying climate science, but I'm very much skeptical around the underlying climate politics that's been pushed by the left. So I think, yeah, it's eaten the environmental movement, but it's kind of like a happy cannibalism on their part. They've been happy to sort of see this because they think they can get everything through climate change. But I think they're concerned that they're now going to run up to, in the next 4 years, where they are not only not going to have the presidency, but pretty darn unlikely to have any other branch of government either. Is I've constantly told environmental groups when I've tried to be a little bit out of the box with them, I said, when I've talked to Democrats who've been interested in moving things, invariably we come to this point, and I start mentioning things like I have a phrase, regulatory heads on pikes, which is sort of a dramatic. It's meant to be a little bit shocking and upsetting, but I say, look, you do some serious reforms on NEPA, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, which doesn't mean gutting, but it means modernizing the parts of them that are stupid and no longer necessary and that we know that don't work, or Endangered Species Act. We can talk about lots of other things, but invariably, the Democrats think they're negotiating with the environmental groups, with Republicans just sort of off there as like, we're only in the game if we're kind of willing to be in between them somewhere. And I'm saying, no, you're negotiating with us, and the environmental groups probably aren't going to end up being that happy with what you wind up with. But if you're serious about actually making real progress on this, you can trade some stuff that you and I both know is bad stuff, like even by your lights, and then maybe I can go to some of my friends and we'll get you some things for that. I don't think they've been willing to have that discussion on the left, and I'm hoping that this will be a little bit of a dose of truth serum or something, or a wake-up call or something for them, so that we can be a little bit more productive.
So I'm writing a note down here. Jeremy Carl wants Tywin Lannister for EPA administrator. Heads on hikes. Okay. I will just mention that you may know this, but someone in this building, though not in this room, has had a conversation with a prominent left-wing environmental philanthropist whose name would be well known, proposing the following deal. We give you a consumption tax, including a big carbon tax on it. What we want in return is repealing the 16th Amendment to get rid of the income tax. And the answer comes back, no.
Right.
Not even willing to consider that deal.
Yeah, and it's just, and we've got a deal maker now walking into the Oval Office. So it's an opportunity if they can get out of that type of thinking.
Right. Let me throw it open to the audience now. Oh, good, we got a whole bunch of questions. Let me take the young man here down on the corner, and then I'll go back to there, and then I'll get to you, then we'll go over to the side. Okay.
My question is sort of like following the logic on dealing with opposition. The other day I have read a book, Getting to Yes, and I have also read Art of the Deal. And one of the ideas running through Getting to Yes, there's actually very few ideas there, but anyway. But a very important one is if you want to have something done, if you're coming to a negotiating table with an intent to get something done, you should be ready to anticipate the other party's expectations and have something in your pocket that will probably have little value for you, but it's going to have an incredible importance for the other party. I guess over the last 8 years, the Democrats have probably failed to do that. They've never suggested Republicans anything that Republicans would basically be able to come home or appear in the television press conference. Yes, we got this. They got this, but we got this. So we were both happy. What would the upcoming administration Republicans be very ready to concede that would have big importance for the left?
I don't know.
I think one of the things, what I said up front, there's a little bit of a blank slate here. I mean, President-elect Trump has said some things on environment and climate, but not a great deal. There haven't been 15 million detailed position papers. So I can talk about some of the things that I think might be interesting to put on the table, but I don't know whether those would be the things that this administration will be interested in giving. I would just say there's a lot of stuff out there. There are things that smart environmentalists know are broken in the rules that would be wins for everybody, that we could give them some things that they would like if we could get those fixed. It's really just a question of whether they're going to be in thrall to the activist groups. And right now they are, So that's the reality that we operate in. And for brave groups like the Breakthrough Institute, which all of us have
had some affiliation, at least moving here to the left, at some level on, that are on the left, but have engaged folks like myself and Steve and others on the right. They have taken a huge beating from their ideological colleagues on the left. And so again, I'd hope that sort of thing would turn around, but there's not a great track record, so maybe reality will wake them up a little bit.
I think the gentleman there had the second hand up.
I guess regarding global warming and regulation, and Republicans or conservatives, their Democrats and EPA are fairly sanguine because they've got the ACE card, which would be the Endangerment Act, the CO2 Endangerment Act. So as long as they've got that, they have the right to do almost anything with global warming. My question is, what is the appetite among conservatives for, reopening the CO2 Endangerment Act? What are the mechanics of it? What is the science? Is the science there to do that? And is there an appetite for it?
I can tell you that my understanding is there's a large appetite for reopening that question. I think I was going to say this, but I didn't want to follow on what Jeremy said. Step back from that particular thing about the endangerment finding and the Clean Power Plan. Look, I think in a whole lot of domains, I'll step out of my moderator role and be a panelist for half a second. In a whole lot of domains, we fall back on the old adage that personnel is policy. A lot of these questions, especially at the EPA, are really going to depend on who the administrator is and who fills some of the important offices like Brent has had. Brent's nodding in agreement. And I think that's going to determine a lot of it. Some of it will be who are some of the policy people in the White House. It's no secret that there's a titanic struggle going on right now around Trump world because he doesn't have a firm sense of these things, and so you have competing factions, and it is going to be the conservative / Republican Game of Thrones here for the next 6 months.
Ooh.
And so who knows? But there is a big appetite on that particular question of the endangerment finding to restart the whole thing. Well, I'm not sure that they're thinking purely as a bureaucratic thing about we don't like this particular one, and I don't know. It's that's a very complicated question involving the Clean Air Act, and there's the whole lawsuit that's right now beyond the Brent, the stuff. Help me out. The beyond the fence rule and all the rest of that. I don't really want to get out too far in the weeds on all that, but there's multiple things in play already before the election, even on that subject.
Yeah, I think the legal questions are still very much in play now. What I would just say is I am hopeful that we as conservatives and Republicans can get past the knee-jerk response, though, that it's a hoax, because I think many of us recognize that some of the science underlying climate change is legitimate, is real. I think there's a lot of questions, a lot of things that we don't know, and exaggeration about the implications. So I am hopeful. I kind of started a firestorm, on Facebook. I'd like to go out and just test ideas and thoughts, and I have liberals and conservative friends that I've shared these thoughts with. And I said, wouldn't it be wonderful, like our presidential debates, we go out and kind of debate climate change, bring in some of the skeptics and some of the, the strong climate scientists, and have this debate. Because I think what's terrible right now is you got half of the public that listens to Rush Limbaugh, and I love Rush, but who calls it a hoax. And then you have others that the world is coming to an end. And it's really sad for those that, don't. It's such a complex science. People do not have the time to understand it. So they look for people that they believe and trust. But credibility is just missing in this space. I am hopeful that we'll have some credible, honest brokers that can openly discuss the science. And no doubt we're going to argue about the policy. But I'm just hopeful at some point we can actually be willing to kind of have an honest dialogue about the science.
I think did you have your hand up? Yeah, you had your hand up third, and I'm going to come over this way. Yeah, 4, remember? Yeah.
Ryan Schinkel, I'm an intern here. We talked earlier this morning about love of home as a motive for protecting the environment because it's ours. I'm wondering, however, about a certain irreducibility of religion as a motive, whether it's, say, sort of your Pope Francis Laudate Si, or something more along the lines of a political zealot you might find in Naomi Klein. I mean, Jonathan Franzen had a quote in The Yorker 2 years ago, "I was raised a Protestant and became an environmentalist." Climate change is the divine judgment of nature, and we are sinners in the hands of an angry earth. That's a paraphrase of his from his article. Basically, that as you had generationally on the left from the 60s and 70s, this religious zeal that made it difficult for a bipartisan consensus on the environment. You also have the same, maybe my generation. I was just out of college a little over a year ago. As much as you've seen the resurgence of socialism with Bernie Sanders college students, you've also seen the resurgence of environmental zeal tied up into it, at least from my own anecdotal experience. So my question is, yes, how are we going to find this kind of religious zeal to it in our environmental questions, and how do conservatives deal with it, channel it, or combat it, or just recognize c'est la vie?
Mark, that feels like a you question.
Do you want to give it a try?
Oh, yeah. It's true that environmentalism in the fin de siècle, starting with Miro, was Calvinism without God. So you could have all of the nature is full of clues and indirections of divine. Nature is suffused with divinity. And then the seculars, what lived by the secularization died by the secularization. And it became more and more bureaucratized, more and more ritualized, right? And so a lot of young people found no place in places like the Sierra Club. They were really thrown out of the Audubon Society when the Audubon Society went, following the EDF, went for Beltway, the Iron Triangle kind of, litigate and legislate kind of thing, instead of serving its local constituencies. So all of that led to an ossification of the religious spirit. Well, what I represented was that the people, especially young people, get very attached, as Roger Scruton said, to even cities, to their communities in Brooklyn or all of these other places. There's a tremendous sense of place. And to me, that means that we have to disaggregate the enthusiasm or the fervor. People can and will, I believe, be fervently attached to places that they care about, to species that they care about, to hikes and so on that they care about. And the successful environmental movement is going to be the movement that was like the Sierra Club and like the National Wildlife Federation, which was very big. And these are all hook and bullet types. These are all local constituencies. The Sierra Club got rid of no longer funded its local chapters. It was a scandal what the Audubon Society did, just taking the money and then hiring economists and lawyers and trying to play the game, because that's where the grants would be, right? That's where the foundations are going to fund you if you're, running around suing the bastard. So it's a big order, but I hope your generation will bring back into play environmental groups that network local efforts, and we can help each other because there's a lot to be learned from different places, but it's got to go back. Also, the hook and bullet. It's got to go back to the people who know, use, and love particular places. Absent that, there's no religious fervor now that the Christianity has been secularized and ossified during the last century.
Here's a piece of trivia for you that is an illustration of how things have changed in the last two generations. Barry Goldwater, remember him, was a member of the Sierra Club.
That I did not know.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Let's see, I think I had you next, yes.
During this administration, we've had a lot of litigation around the Clean Power Plan, as the gentleman alluded to here. If we go in the other direction, we may very well have environmentalists litigating and saying they're not enforcing the endangerment finding and so on relating to CO2. Wouldn't a very simple area of agreement between the sides be nuclear energy being one area which is carbon-free, to do more, to break down the barriers? We have licensing problems. It takes years and years and years for licensing. We have other countries in the world, China and others, that are moving forward at much greater pace. So American leadership is being lost in the area of nuclear energy if we don't do more. Carbon capture. You can use captured carbon, to enhance oil recovery. At the same time, you can then get greater utilization out of fossil fuels like coal and natural gas because you can capture the carbon, and therefore you address that concern. So isn't that an area where we can have some very substantial agreement and dramatically reduce carbon emissions, but yet get dramatically more larger quantities of American energy?
Any of you, Jeremy, you think about a lot of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Stevens and Task Force.
Everything you said is logical. I don't think it's impossible. I think, per some of my earlier comments, you need an agreement between Democrats and Republicans. Environmentalists, just because it's logical and rational, doesn't mean they're going to go with it. Not just because I view that they have a lot of irrational views that are not really backed by science, although I think many of them do, but because their institutional incentives are to continue to sue, to continue to oppose, and they've got donors, big donors who want them to do that, and they will ultimately call the shots. But I do think that on things like nuclear, on CCS for EOR, enhanced oil recovery, and some of these other things, there are absolutely more things that we can and should be doing. These are absolutely areas that are ripe for political agreement, but the left's got to decide where they want that.
Well, you have in 2018, you have 10 Senate Democrats up for re-election in states that Trump carried. So that could give them some incentive to look at.
Let's hope.
I just want to say one thing about nuclear. Its time will come. It's the problem for nuclear. I guess there are three. One is the price of gas. If gas is going to be so cheap, nuclear just doesn't cut it economically. And the other is now there are so many different alternative technologies. I don't think it makes economic sense for GE to go with one kind of reactor because with China and so forth, there's so much going on. They may want to wait 10, 15 years to get the alternative technologies sorted out as to which one they want to standardize. I forgot that. And then the least important is opposition from the environmentalists. I mean, we saw Michael Schellenberger lead a march. I think the environmentalists really can crack and give on nuclear. So it's just the price of gas and the difficulty of resolving which of the many different kinds of approaches technologically you want to use.
Yeah, I'll just add real quick that I've had more than one quite prominent environmentalist at my age, a little older, say the single biggest mistake he made in his whole career was opposing a nuclear power 40 years ago.
Right.
A lot of them are really rethinking this. I sort of joke that means conservatives will have to be against it. No, but I do think we do, as Mark says, one difficulty now is it would require subsidies probably, at least the current, and I think we'd want to be very careful about that, right?
Well, there you go.
I mean, it's a messy field, all the subsidies and all the rest of that.
Or it could be put into an RPS, which it's not, right? Like, and I'm not saying that that's the best.
Yes.
I'm not saying that's the best solution, but I have fought the state of California on this particular issue, right? All these states have renewable portfolio standards that are theoretically really about carbon, but yet zero carbon nuclear or big hydro is not included in them. Why? Because environmentalists think they're icky, not because of any science.
Right.
No, the closure of Diablo Canyon in California is being driven by California's very perverse renewable mandate that specifically excludes nuclear and the pressure they brought on the utilities. It's completely correct. I can say a lot more about all that in French and all the rest of that. But let's see. I think someone in the back had a question, and I'm going to come to you, right? Okay, I forgot you a minute there.
My name is Rick Otis from the Earth and Water Group, along with Brent. I want to make more of a comment and see how you guys react to it and see what you think. But you asked about the endangerment finding. There are clean air experts. I'm not one. I know enough to be dangerous. But my guess is that one of its greater vulnerabilities and one reason why you might be able to more easily open it up is it's open to the accusation of conflict of interest in its peer review. If you look at the people who peer reviewed it and provided agency advice to the agency, scientists who peer reviewed it and provide advice to the agency, a lot of those are people that have agency grants, which to me starts to sound like a conflict of interest. So that may be one way it can be opened up as conflict of interest provisions. I want to sort of play the role of a cynical skunk and suggest that I don't think you're going to find negotiations. I don't think you're going to find something that you can give the political left. They'll give you something else. They control the communications machinery. They control a better understanding of law. There's a lot of things that they are much, much better at than we are. And I would argue it goes back to the point about polling. In a meeting in Clinton's midterm election, I was in a meeting here in D.C. where large donors were privileged to listen to a political strategist from the Republican side and Democratic side, the kind of person you hire to get you elected to the White House. And I asked the question, how do you think the environment will play in this election cycle? The Republican strategist said, the polling numbers tell us it's number 19 out of 20, nobody cares. The Democrat said, I've known you and loved you for 40 years in this city, you're wrong, you don't get it. We'll make you anti-environment the same way make you anti-Social Security and old people and so on and so forth. And therein lies the fact that we never seem to appreciate the key point that you made about if you disrupt what the public sees as a settled issue, the angst. Well, that angst clearly shows up in places at the local level. So we never train our troops, we never train our think tanks, we never train ourselves how to communicate and convince people that we have, whether it's free market environmentalism or some of the things we talked about today, we never convince people, voters, especially when you're a congressman looking at a local environmental issue which may get you unelected at the national level, we never train ourselves how to talk about the topic. I sat at a reception for free market environmentalists with a drink in my hand in Las Vegas one time, and I said, I agree with everything you just told me. Now, we have the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, FRIFRA, TSCA, everything else at the federal level and local level. How are we going to get from here to that nirvana? And I got this blank look. And one of which was how to get somebody who could talk about free market environmentalism in a think tank context to say, how are you going to say that to someone who has no idea what you're talking about?
Right.
They just looked at me with like, I don't know.
That's not my job.
Yeah. So the question in part is, how do we develop the tools, train our young kids in college to understand how to talk about this in a way where we take away the political left's biggest tool, which is they beat us up in the public arena all the time?
Oh, I could go on a rant on that. But Carla, you want to take a first stab at that?
I do think an enormous amount of training is needed for people at think tanks to talk about these issues. You've always got to start with values. Dan Yankelowitz, the great sociologist, wrote an essay a long time ago in which he suggested that all of us in this room base our views on the accumulation of factual knowledge. Publics rarely do. You've always got to start with values because we're not well informed. We're not going to understand all the acronyms that you just mentioned overall. But you've got to talk about them in the sense that you believe this is a consensual value, that we have agreed on it. We want a clean, healthful environment. We're going to spend a lot of money on it. And you've got to start there with that central value. But we need to do a lot of work in this area.
Let me follow up with you, Carlin, on one thing that both you and Mr. Otis said. It was that only, I think the way you put it, was only a actual threat would disrupt this current dysfunctional equilibrium in favor of the sort of old-style environmentalism. Mm-hmm. And so the two-part question is, one is, and maybe someone here in the audience can think of an example, though I want to get to you. That presents, it seems to me, really bad incentives to environmentalists to double down on alarm, and we've seen them try to say, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, and things of that kind. And that doesn't seem to work, though.
Well, I know nothing about this person who's being mentioned as the transition person, but you already see the efforts to talk about him in a way that he's going to be a threat to this consensus we've agreed upon, just as Jim Watt was supposed to be in Gorsuch. And so you already see the beginnings of what they're going to try to do on that front. I don't know whether it'll be a policy issue, but they can demonize people.
I will just add briefly about that, Jim Watt and Gorsuch back in 1980, 81. Remember that the EPA was only 10 years old in 1980.
Right, exactly.
They were still figuring out how to do basic stuff, and that's why Superfund was passed in this enormous thing, and took years to get that figured out. Now we're another 35 years along, so I think it'll be different. Maybe I'm not sure. Anyway, ma'am, you've been waiting patiently.
My name is Tricia Bonner. I work for Washington Gas, and I've pretty much spent my career in the energy sector. And I just wanted to, build on Carlin. I think you made the point that the technology is out there to do what we need. I think the issue, or where the work really comes in, is finding the applications and then figuring out who's going to pay for it. So in my career, I've found significant opportunity in the free market solutions of setting the standard, the RPS or the emission reduction standard, and then allowing the free market to trade the credits on this. That's where we find a lot of our funding for renewable energy projects. Can you speak to the sustainability of that under the new administration and the effectiveness from your perspectives?
I can't.
Did I stump y'all?
No, good question. But
Well,
Very good question.
I mean, a lot of the RPS standard, renewable portfolio standard, that's a state-by-state thing, and they're controversial. I'm not sure. There is some federal leverage through FERC, or some federal involvement through FERC. I expect you're about to see a divide between red states and blue states. California's doubling down with a completely insane, no carbon energy standard, very 2030 or something like that. And I think other states are going to back away from it. And like so many other red-blue state divisions in a lot of areas, we're going to start to see a division there. Because I think the action's going to be on the state level. That's probably getting the wonky stuff. Let's see. Yep.
I just wanted to build on one earlier, the earlier sort of question / comment on communication and how we're not very good at it on the right when it comes to environment, which I certainly agree with. But he also touched on another thing, which I think is even more important, and I do agree, skunk in the garden party, I don't think the left will deal. I don't think they're going to do let's make a deal, is that the left owns the bureaucracy in these areas. And if there's anywhere where I would love this administration to make a frontal assault, it is there. And there's going to be a huge fight. But I think, the civil service as currently constituted in this country is just a kind of left-wing policy protection scheme, okay? I'm not saying I want to go back to the sort of was it Rutherford B. Hayes or whatever
Pendleton Act,
we got it. I mean, I'm not saying but I think we need to be honest as conservatives that as long as you have a bunch of left-wing activists who are in the permanent bureaucracy who really ultimately control everything, the left is not going to do deals, and they're not going to be incentivized to do deals. And so you have to disrupt that in some way within the laws, or introduce new laws so that you can get a less ossified bureaucracy that's more willing to be flexible on a lot of these issues.
I think Brent wants to defend left-wing activists.
Yeah,
in bureaucracy.
Jeremy, let me just, I'll differ from you a little bit. Having been at the agency, there definitely, you have the ideologues that will do as you say they're going to do and be obstreperous. But I would say, by and large, you have people that show up every day that want to make a difference, that want to actually see a cleaner environment. And if you put new ideas in front of them and give them the opportunity to implement those, I think you're going to see a different bureaucracy. I'm not an EPA hater. In fact, I feel very strongly that it's an agency with an important mission. It's just been misguided and co-opted by some.
I think there's a chance we're going to see some legislation reopened and some restructuring in some fundamental ways. We may even see a new Administrative Procedure Act.
I think you're right.
But that'll work in a lot of areas. But I think we're kind of at the end of the line in a lot of ways. But what are thoughts on that? What a quarter of federal employees said they might quit if Trump.
Yep. It's a good way to reduce the agencies.
Let's see. Let me get this gentleman here, and then we're running out of time, so we got to go quickly if we can.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for what's been a really interesting discussion. I also want to repeat my question from the earlier session. We do know that greenhouse gas emissions represent a market failure because those who emit get a subsidy from everybody else. They don't pay the costs. We also know we don't know what those costs are. They could be very high. They could not be very high. And so we have, in attempting to account for that subsidy, we can't price it, but we know it's there. So I guess my question is, do we think that conservatives are open to that market solution, recognizing that one has to either underprice or overprice that externality?
I'm going to can I throw this to Jeremy, who recently debated William Nordhaus at Yale, who is, Professor Nordhaus is maybe the leading climate economist in the world, I think.
Yeah,
and is that what your debate with him bear on this question, maybe, I think?
Very much so. And it's interesting because Bill, who's the current president of the American Economic Association, and I were on different parts of the political spectrum, but we actually had a lot of overlap, including, and I think you've made a concession, which I got him to make, even though he's the one who's designed a lot of these pricing models, but that the left has not made at all, which is we have no idea what those damages are. The left wants to pretend, and does it through a lot of administrative rulemakings, among other things, that there's some social cost of carbon that we have any idea what it is. We have no idea what it is. I would argue it's really strongly empiric finding that we don't have any idea what it is. So ultimately it comes down to a value judgment, right? Like about how you value risk, how you value all these other things. I would say, given the comments of the president-elect, I would not be particularly optimistic unless the Democrats want to do a big "let's make a deal" thing, because I don't think it's his hill he wants to die on necessarily. But I'd say the broader point, which is, again, the left loves to claim science, but when you actually talk to a guy like Professor Nordhaus, who is very much for climate action, and we have plenty of disagreements on climate. But when pinned down in a public forum about whether he believes there's any way to actually value this stuff, he says no, there's not, and that is not what the left says, right? I mean, so.
Mark is shaking his head.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say what Roger Scruton says. It's not a collective action problem, because collective action problems involve a reciprocity of interest. I give up some rights because I gain more from your giving up your rights than I lose from giving up mine. So it involves costs to people alive today. And Roger Scruton had already told us that the cost will fall on people generations from now, and they can't represent themselves and say what the damage to them is. Absent that, we do not know the damage, what it will be. There's no way to know because we can't talk to these people. However, insofar as there are values involved, we may want to, or do want to, go to energy policies and energy technologies that are cleaner if this doesn't really cost that much to us.
Right.
And the book to read on this is called Risk, Profit, and Uncertainty by Mark Sagoff, isn't it? Well, I know it's a little older one. Roger?
Yeah. About this point, I agree, of course, everything that Mark's just said, but when Blair was in government and the Labour Party was agitating about these environmental things, they commissioned a report from Stern.
Stern Review, right.
Yeah. And it was a huge, long thing published. An economist, about what is the cost, what will the cost be of climate change, and how do we compensate for that? And he produced this completely fraudulent document, which the way of estimating the cost was so absurd in purely economic terms, and factoring in that there'll be economic growth, so we'll be able to take charge of this more efficiently. We'll put in a percentage of reduction of the cost for that, etc. All the things that academic economists are terribly good at, a sort of second-rate amateur mathematics. And as a result of this, he was made into a peer. He's now Lord Stern, and given all kinds of positions. He's president of the British Academy, the academy which represents people like me, so he is the great figure. And the report it was put on a shelf, and that was the end of it. But it's important that when things get into the hands of economists, usually it's because it's not a problem that's soluble by economists. And so that the politicians can say, we've done this, and let's move on to the next thing. And I think that's the same is going to happen here, obviously.
I think the best person, just mention a name, the best person to read on this subject is Richard Toll, who's Danish, German, I forget what he is. He's something, Dutch. Okay, I was close, right? Anyway, but that's a long subject. Let's see, you had a hand up, I think. There we are, and then I'll get you, and I think with an end. So.
All right, so I want to go back to the issue of communication and just stitch some comments that I've heard. This is refreshing. I usually go to liberal talks because that's how I like to define myself, but this is very refreshing, and I'm glad that I actually came today to hear a different perspective. But these are the comments that I've heard. So I've heard a comment about let's debate, let's have a climate debate and see where we stand on this issue. I heard a comment that, how do we train our people to communicate about climate? But I'm going to start with a comment and then morph that into a question. The alarming aspect of these comments is that I didn't hear the word science, which is the word that I hear every single time that I go to a climate debate on the liberal side. Like every time, every single liberal, when they open the debate about climate, they start with the word science and they tell you what the science means. And the statistic that is flown around is that 97% or maybe 99%, but 90-something% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real, it's happening, it's important, and we need to address it now. So on this issue of communication, why do we always feel the urge, and by we, I mean like, the group here, or do we, I should say, do we feel the urge to challenge climate science and reinvent the wheel and say, there's something wrong with the science? Or are we willing, as conservatives, to say, the science is settled, climate change is happening, now let's debate the policy, but not the science?
Right. Well, I guess I'd just say, and I'll let Brent say this, is first, I don't want to waste time on this, that 97% figure is just one of the flimsiest, shabbiest. If you read the actual Cook paper it's based on, the abstract of the paper doesn't even say that if you read it carefully. But that's the headline that's gone out and it's stuck, and so we're stuck with it forever. But let's just go with it. Well, Volume 1, I think I count this up. Volume 1 uses the word uncertain or uncertainty 1,100 times. That's what Brent is saying we should talk about. What do we not know? He didn't say whether it's happening or not.
Exactly right.
What do we know and what do we not know? What are we uncertain about? What do we need to know more about?
And it's also...
I just say my last sentence
go
is
ahead.
Science tells you what is. It doesn't tell you what to do or how to do it. That's mostly what Hoover's about and their think tanks, is what to do and how to do it. I'm very interested in the scientific questions. In defense of our approach here.
And the only reason I suggested possibly debating the science was to inform the public, because as we know, policy, you have to have the public that agrees on the science before policy changes are made. So put the science out there, explain what we know and what we don't know. I think the gravest damage that we've seen to the whole issue of climate change is the exaggeration by those who have made it a political issue. And they've exaggerated it, and everybody says, oh, it didn't come true. We don't believe it. So you've got all this noise out there. Nobody knows who to believe or what to believe on the issue. We've got to have greater credibility, and that's why we need to actually have the public understand it. But let me just say, climate change is one thing. I'd say there's 90% of, there's endangered species, there's water issues, dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Chesapeake Bay. My goodness, let's focus on some things that we actually can have some agreement on and fix those things. Can I just bring it real back to kind of Roger? What I love about Roger's book and the idea of love of home, noicophilia, is I've spent the better part of 2 decades trying to promote market-based approaches to cleaning up water. You have in the Chesapeake Bay millions, possibly billions of sources of non-point sources that are unregulated. You cannot regulate all the sources of pollution. So you have to allow the states and the local stakeholders to fix that. Have the science establish what the pollutants should be going into the water bodies, and let the local players figure out how to do it. And what's exciting about that, you're not only going to get a cleaner environment, you've got farmers talking to environmental groups, talking to business people. This is the way the civic organizations and the communication and the local governments that actually comes out of these ideas. And that to me is as exciting as fixing the environmental pollution itself.
And they're the great example, I think, for Chesapeake Bay is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. I'm going to give you the last question.
I just wanted to bring it back really quick to the idea of uncertainty and what the effect of cutting carbon emissions would be. If the only thing that we can know for certain is that cutting emissions will not have a negative effect, wouldn't that be and correct me if I'm wrong, but ideologically the conservative route to take?
Well, it depends on what the cost is, right? I mean, I think, again, all these things are value judgments. And to kind of circle back to the earlier question, because I think it's kind of getting at the same thing, I'm not an expert in the relevant science, which is not a dodge. I mean, that's one of the reasons I just don't talk. I mean, I'm not. My father's a research scientist, so I have respect for what they do and not to just kind of mouth off about it. I can tell you that, speaking to your comments around the politicization of some of these issues, I'm asked to accept a bunch of science that I'm being given.
Yep.
But yet, when they get into domain areas like the economics and things that I do know more about, they insist it's at the same level of truth, and I know it's nonsense. And in fact, I got Bill Nordhaus, on video, you could look at it on YouTube, basically admitting it was nonsense, right? And so that it doesn't make me do nothing, right? Like on the standards of the right, I'm kind of on the left as far as what we should do on climate. But it makes me suspicious, especially when I see things like Naomi Klein out there with these, very political agendas. So that's where I think some of the skepticism comes from.
Let me, we're actually starting to run over time. Let me see if I can't draw this to a close with sort of this idea. Nordhaus, his work is used but nobody is more conventional or orthodox, whatever word you want to use that's non-pejorative understanding about climate change than he is. But his own economic work is used by the so-called, I don't like but the skeptics, right, to point out the problems of economic discounting. The problem is that we've never had a problem like this. This is why Nordhaus and Steve Rayner at London School of Economics say this is an especially wicked problem. And I think it was a mistake, a fundamental mistake, which, by the way, you could blame partly the first Bush administration for, of conceiving of this problem simply as a large air pollution problem. Shouldn't have been, that was a fundamental mistake to think of it that way, and therefore it's just some kind of different Clean Air Act. And it's taken a long time to understand that. I think a lot of environmentalists understand that, even if they're path dependent the way we've been going. And here we are. Part of our agenda today was to not get away from climate or ignore it, but to try and say, as Brent just did, and the reason I asked the question earlier, because there are actually other problems out there that are in the shade. But that's also finally to say in a not quite entirely coherent way, but we have to wrap up. We're over time. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, panel, for trying to stimulate some new vocabularies and new imagination for all these things. And we're adjourned. Thank you for coming.